Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Axioms on Trial. I'm super excited to take a pause on life and do this stream, and I get to be a viewer today, so it makes it really awesome for me as well. I'm going to just go ahead and pass it off to Cease. How you feeling, man? What are you looking forward to today in the show, and what's new?
Not so much. Just trying to finish school, same as always. I'm been looking forward to having this conversation for a while now. Me and Jeff and I interacted online a few times, and some things were said that I really want to question him on, to try to make sure that that I'm understanding him correctly, and two, where I think the problems lie in the discussions that we had. And so yeah, I'm excited to have this conversation.
Yeah, me as well. Our goal, if you just subscribe, we got a lot more subscribers. We actually just broke 100, so thank you to everybody that helped us do that in a quick time.
Thank you so much.
Pasta Mike and the Tart guys had a lot to do and to help us with that. They posted a video. Actually went on there not that long, or a couple days ago, to talk with counter apologetics on TikTok, and they ended up plugging a video for us on there, and so we really appreciate that. So thank you to everybody. But what I wanted to say was that generally what we're going to try to do is get one-on-one conversations with theists, whether it be me and a theist, Cease and a theist. Sometimes we'll do a collaboration. Sometimes we'll host actual debates, things like that. So if you want to do a debate, it doesn't have to be just us. We want to host debates. We want to get people up on here. We'll be working on that a little bit more in the future. But be prepared for some video breakdowns and some one-on-one theists in the near future. That said, I'm going to go ahead and bring our guest in here. And that, if you guys already know him, you might follow him on TikTok or any of his other social medias, where I'm not sure if he has other ones other than TikTok, but if you do, go ahead and feel free to plug that, Jeff, and give us a little details about yourself.
Yeah, so I do have a TikTok. That's actually how I came, I guess, to know these guys. And then I have a YouTube channel that's not all that special, I guess. It's just kind of the same thing. Me talking into the front-facing mic, or in the front-face camera of my phone. And that's kind of it. Just I do a lot of kind of monologue content, I guess. So is what it is.
And I want to go ahead and throw out this comment at you. Is he in a warehouse? Does that ring any bells for you at all?
Oh, shoot. Yeah, I was like, yeah, no. So today's Thursday. I do not have to work. I have all the time in the world. It will not be super loud or interrupted.
Oh, no, it's all good. And for those that might not catch the reference, me and Jeff had a conversation when I was on the Atheist Roundtable. And we tried to book that together, and that, it was, I think we can all relate, sometimes you can't necessarily pinpoint the time where you're going to be away from work, considering the circumstances that everybody has to go through.
Right, it was in the middle of all the COVID and everything.
Yeah, exactly.
Just all that. So no, yeah, I am actually at home. So yeah. One problem definitely averted, at the very least.
Sure. And so you are a Christian. Did you have any denomination that you'd want to specifically put out there before I hand the ropes to you and Cease?
Yeah, so I am a Christian, raised Pentecostal, which doesn't always rub off completely, but I'm definitely more in the conservative, like Reformed type circumstance, I guess. Now it's one of those of that the more I read, the more that kind of the baseline kind of shifts of where I would say of which the church I go to currently is non-denominational, which creates even more kind of fluidity that way. I mean, the more I read like older theologians, the more older theologian-y I get. And if I read more modern, like I kind of move back and kind of just back around, which also applies to like what we'll talk about first, which is in philosophy and stuff. I noticed that you begin to see the world through whatever kind of is the more recent thing that you've been exposed to. And so, I mean, just it's all kind of like it basically, I mean, Christian theist, but I kind of moves around beyond that
Sure. And that's what we'll probably get a lot more into general problems. And I know Cease is going to hand that off, or take that away. So I'm going to go ahead and hand that off to you, Cease, and you guys can go ahead and get started. If you guys can, go ahead and give me some questions in the comments. We will do a Q&A this time. Please direct it to either Cease or Jeff, or myself if you want, but I don't know why anybody would want to hear anything I have to say. So just direct your question, and then I'll compile those at the end, and we will ask those. So looks like we got about 8 people that just joined on here, so I think it's a good time to go ahead and start. I'll let you guys start it.
Hey, Jeff. How you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Not too bad. So I asked you on because we had a few different conversations that I wanted to get some clarification on, and so it's three different claims that you made that I took issue with, and so we'll deal with them one by one, probably from the easiest one to the more difficult question. And I want to make sure that I'm not misrepresenting what you've said. So I'm going to make sure that I'll ask you now to clarify. You had at one point said in our conversations that you believe psychology disproves the idea that free will is an illusion. So you had said that if you look at psychology, you can easily see where free will fits, and that determinism is a non-starter in that context. And your explanation for that was that people can react to the same situation differently, and that in your mind that shows that is a level of choice that one has. Am I correct in describing your argument in that way?
Okay, so first to clarify a little bit on my end as well, you are a pure determinist, no free will whatsoever?
I don't see a context in which determinism, in which free will makes sense. I don't hold any certainty in my belief systems. What I would say is that I have beliefs that I think are reasonable, given the level of information that we have. But I would never say that anything is certain.
Okay, because little background maybe. I started out as a pure libertarian free will. When I first began to kind of study the subject, whereas now I am a compatibilist. I spent a little bit of time of just pure naturalistic determinist. Everything can be boiled down to like neurological firings and the influence of maybe unknown or circumstantially invisible circumstances that are kind of influences. But I'm a compatibilist currently. I don't know if that probably answers a lot of the questions you're asking already.
I mean, to some degree, from my perspective, compatibilism seems to beg the question from my point of view. I don't think, because, well, let me ask this. How are you defining the term for those that might not be aware of what these things mean?
Okay, so compatibilism is the idea that we live with, there are unknown or like predetermined circumstances or circumstantial influences that we're unaware of that determine a lot of things. But we also, with compatibilism, is the idea that that free will is compatible in that kind of natural worldview, I guess, or is natural in that environment of that. Yes, there are things that we are not consciously aware of that influence our decisions, but at the end of it, we are still making an autonomous choice based on those things. So you may not be aware of all the influences that you encounter, but you are still free to make those decisions, that you still are making a conscious active choice.
So where is the aspect of choice coming in when whatever decision you're making is based on a prior set of neurological chain of cause and effect that you're not the author of. I mean, this is more so than it's not just a matter of there being factors that we're not conscious of. The problem for determinism is that everything that we can say about what we are, our thoughts, our what we would call decision making, our beliefs, our actions, are all a result of things that we didn't have the freedom to choose or alter. And when you made the claim that if two people go through to the same trauma and one person is able to deal with it differently, they're able to use it to make themselves stronger or approach their trauma differently, that proves free will. I think that's quite problematic because yes, we all share a certain level of phenomenology to a close degree, but we're not all carbon copies of each other. We do have differences, enough difference that nobody in psychology is claiming that we're all going to react the same way based on every event. What we're saying is that all the reactions that one can possibly have is still determined on factors that we're not choosing, authoring, or having control over. If I decide to get up and get a glass of water, what eventually pushes me to make that step is not a free choice in the way that people seem to want to use the word, it seems to me. And so, I'm just wondering to what in psychology have you read that's convinced you of what you've claimed? Because I don't see that. It doesn't make sense to me.
Well, most recently, I just finished a book called Freedom of the Will, where it talks, it's more of a, it more focuses on the moral implications of the conflict between free will and determinism. It brings up the question, which is in some ways a little bit of a straw man, but I think there is some validity to it, of that if everything is predetermined, you do not have an active opportunity of choice, then there is no morality either. The person who kills didn't have a choice not to kill. The person who rapes, the person who, you can fill in anything in the end of that sentence. If they didn't have an opportunity to choose not to, then they cannot be held accountably autonomous for the outcome of that action either. So it focuses more in that direction. I think, and the main reason that I would say that I am more of a compatibilist is to create, or to kind of adjudicate that circumstances of that we have a problem in society if you are going to claim that everything was predetermined by subconscious or unconscious influences, and no one has the freedom of choice to do otherwise than what has been predetermined for them, whether materially or supernaturally, then no entity has the authority to hold them accountable for that behavior, regardless of whether you take personal offense to that behavior or not. Like, it creates a serious problem. And so that's, it kind of pushes me in towards the compatibilist framework as opposed to being deterministic. But I'm also I'm not willing to go all the way, like you said, that I used to be libertarian free will, that everyone has the freedom to do whatever it is they want no matter what. And that's clearly not the case either. That we are very much so prone to, and in many ways enslaved to, subconscious influences that sometimes we're aware of, sometimes we're not aware of, sometimes we're so enslaved by them that even though we are aware of them, we still choose to act in concert with what they're telling us to do anyways, even if we have a moral, a psychological, or a natural or like objection towards them. We still do those things. So yes, there are influences in society, in our own personal beings, that cause us or push us towards this, that, or some other thing. But it also creates a problem for the concept of things like consent, because if everything's determined, and everything is determined, whether it's by physical or non-physical causes, then the idea of consent, which is based on and founded in a concept of personal autonomy, does not exist either. So it creates issues that our society can't function in a purely deterministic format like that, is kind of my major, I guess, objection towards it.
Okay, so let me respond to this in a number of different ways. The first is that there seems to me to be a very clear distinction between what we might want to be true and what there is evidence to believe for something to be true. From my perspective, you should build your worldview based on what you have good reasons for, not an inherent bias towards, you don't like the idea of something, and so that's the motivator to push you toward having a particular position. That seems to me to be intellectually problematic. You're already going into the conversation with a bias of what you want to be the case, rather than looking at what the evidence is pointing to. So what you just described is a sort of an appeal to emotion, which, by the way, there's another part of my response of why I actually don't think there is this tension, this problem you just described. What were you going to say?
Well, no. So it's not that I wish that free will existed. It's that society can't function without free will. When we're talking about like criminal justice, if we're talking about any form, like two people interacting in the same space, especially in the grounds of things like justice, consent, things like that, those don't exist on a deterministic worldview. They can't exist. And so it's not an issue. So it's not an issue of me like, man, I really wish free will existed so that we could punish people that do bad things. It's that as far as being trueness or being true to reality, reality functions in that these things do, like you can say, like that it is an axiomatic truth that free will has to in some measure exist, otherwise society itself does not exist either. And the ideas that we exist that we use to police human behavior don't exist either, like justice, like consent, like if those things don't exist either, then we are it's a slippery slope fallacy, and I'll grant that. But then what is it that we use, or what can we appeal to for the purpose of limiting human depravity, limiting human aggressions and hostilities towards one another?
Okay, so I can answer that, and which is why I don't buy into this idea that without free will, a notion of morality gets lost. You might be right in saying that a notion of moral responsibility in the way that it's classically understood might have to shift. But the concern for well-being and for suffering, which I think is fundamental to the question of morality, is not affected. Here's why. What we appeal to is the reality of our phenomenology. So whether or not, it's not like, if I look at if a bear is coming at me and is going to kill me, I'm going to protect myself. whether or not I believe that the bear is free to make that choice or is just reacting to instinct is irrelevant to what I'm going to do to protect myself. So it's not like, if...
Well, that's a straw man because of the fact that it's using a non-moral agent as an example. I'm talking specifically solely in the realm of human-on-human interactions. That's like the bear doesn't ask for consent before it mauls you, but we expect men and women to ascertain consent before engaging in sexual activity, right?
Yeah, but you're assuming, sure, but you're assuming that if everything is caused, that, for example, the sexual education could be what we would view as a cause to instill consent in the way people interact with each other. So it's not like
that doesn't solve the problem, though, because of the fact that, right, let's say if we had whatever your definition of robust and reliable sexual education, that wouldn't change a predetermined outcome between two individuals because it's determined.
No, but every factor you can introduce adds an additional cause and effect to the chain that's taking place. By the predetermined, I don't mean that a person, is always, from the start, was always going to do the same thing. The behavior is going to change and the reactions are going to change given other causes. Now, the other causes you don't find free will in that new set of causes. You just find more factors that can influence behavior. So I'm not claiming that the person who was going to rape, would have raped, maybe they would have raped without having had access to a certain level of education, that once having that access would not perform the same behavior. Now, you might be right in saying that they might not be morally, they might not be, you couldn't hold them accountable in the same type of way. But it doesn't mean that we should somehow accept those horrible behaviors or tolerate them in society, or tolerate them in interrelational, dealings with other people, because those situations still have a very observable phenomenological consequence that we can still point to and say, we don't want this as part of our society, regardless of whether or not there is freedom there. I mean, one of the reasons why people who go to prison end up going back again and again and again, because we have a system built on punishment as opposed to, and blame, as opposed to a system built on trying to, what is the word I'm looking for? Rehabilitate these people into society by applying different tools that all these things are ignored because we have sort of obsession with this idea that what we're doing is completely autonomous, and so we should just think I'm in no point in my position am I somehow advocating for tolerating rape or tolerating crime or tolerating any behavior that we can both agree is abhorrent. I think there's different tactics.
But the issue that I think that where we really disagree is not in whether or not we can or should tolerate these issues. Like, we agree, it seems that these things do need to be, I guess, quarantined or whatever it needs to do in order to eliminate those things from society. I think we seem to agree about that. The question is how can you, in a society that, like, let's say with the example of that you believe that sex education has the ability to purge society from, or has the ability to, let's word it like this maybe. If every teenager of fill in the blank age, every adolescent was put through this specific, absolutely flawless, perfect sexual education program, and then at the end of that program that they would never have the desire to rape someone else. Like whatever that imaginative, like fairy tale version of sex education would be. If we can guarantee that, does that mean that if someone didn't go to that, or let's say, I mean, we live in a society that's like this. Let's say like the parents decided to keep their kid out of that program, and that kid grows up and in college or whatever, and they rape someone. Are they morally or legally responsible for that act? And it would seem.
Certainly, because
No, go ahead.
yeah, because it depends on how you define the terms. They are responsible in the sense that they are the cause for the harm done to society or to the individual. Again, it might be, I can recognize that there is, so we might be talking about responsibility in a different sense in this context. But certainly there will be, you know, regardless of their freedom in doing what they've done, we're still going to protect ourselves, and they're still going to be legally responsible because we are a part of a society, and are still going to protect ourselves accordingly. Whether or not they're free to make the choice, so to speak, you know, the fact remains that, you know, we're going to protect ourselves the way that we should. Now, if you want to say they're not responsible in the same type of a way that they will be if we assume free will, I can acknowledge that. But they will still be responsible the same way that any, you know, earlier you said that I was making a straw man. I don't think I am, because I think ultimately everything is dependent on things that we're not choosing. So I don't think that there's this clear separation between animals and humans. Of course, I mean there are some differences, but anyway, I'm not saying that, you know, that with certainty that free will is impossible. I'm saying that in all my years of trying, because if there's anything that I want to be true, it's that I want free will to be true. So I'm not inherently, I want it to be the case that free will exists. If I have a bias towards any concept, it's that. I just haven't found a convincing argument in support of it. And for me, the moral argument is not a reason that pushes me towards compatibilism, because I think that we're going to protect ourselves either way. So it doesn't actually undermine the legality of that, or how we would view somebody that would do this harm. And as far as, I think it's an open question as to how we might go about implementing certain things in society to lower these behaviors. I think education is a great tool. I think philosophy is a great tool. I think the building of empathy is a great tool. And, you know, I recognize that some people might not, you know, have that capacity there, and then we have to deal with those people in a different way and figure things out. But I'm just not sure that this is as much of a problem as you're claiming it is.
I think it creates like the matter of that justice is built on, as a foundation, the idea of that you had the choice not to. Whether that's, I mean, we can fill in whatever offensive thing of, like, right now, racism and sexism tend to be on the radar of, like, that the reason something is objectionable is the implication or the assumption that a person had the choice to not do that, and they chose to do it anyway. And with a purely deterministic environment or world, like kind of thought sphere, the choice to do otherwise cannot be assumed, and actually that it's not even possible. And so as a result, like, it sells the store on the concepts of justice and social reform, even these things of, like, you want a justice system that prioritizes rehabilitation, that presumes the ability of a person to make different choices if they had different or better or whatever your definition of information is. And
I
in a
disagree with that.
deterministic environment, I don't think that that assumption is valid. Unless you assume that a person has the freedom to make a choice, then with even a compatibilistic worldview of free will, then any attempts to rehabilitate someone in the future or to end around and prevent something initially, they're all they're based on assumptions that can't be justified.
I don't think you need to assume free will at all to look at rehabilitation as an important factor to implement in society. You can look at the cause and effect, the chains of cause and effect, and recognize that certain tools are going to function as certain causes to help people rehabilitate. You may be right that a notion of justice in the context of choice wouldn't function the way that it used to. But a notion of justice as a tool of protection and as a tool of fairness can entirely remain by simply looking at the consequences and the phenomenological results in terms of what does behavior do to consciousness. All those things can be retained. All the same concerns we have towards suffering and well-being can be retained without having to assume free will. It's not like, the moment that we don't believe in free will, we stop caring about fairness, or we stop caring about violence that could be done to us. We're going to care about those things regardless of whether we think that the person doing the harm chose to do so or not. I'm still going to protect myself.
I don't know if that's true either, because if you look through history and the most authoritarian regimes that believed specific things, like that the darker skinned people are biologically inferior, that it's been determined by God or by nature that they would be subservient to whites, that when you see that it doesn't induce empathy, it doesn't induce a sensation of caring for others. That's not a natural or let's say a biological product of that kind of thinking. That if things are specifically are predetermined by circumstantial influences that you're not in control of, that in fact actually that makes an infinitely more unfair environment. Think about the way that all of nature's ecosystems function. The sick, the weak, the young, and the infirm, those are the ones that get devoured. Yet as human beings, we value the care and the protection of those specific classes, the elderly and the disabled and such. Those are the ones that are most likely to be to be taken out of the gene pool and stuff. When you look through history, is when human beings have adopted that kind of predeterministic or natural, biologically sterile perspectives about other human beings. It's made them more calloused. It's made them more likely to justify violence towards whoever they believe to be unfit or have been determined by their deity or whatever to be inferior, whether that's the Indian caste systems or if that's the feudal striations of society and things like that. Those things do not induce a greater care towards others, but instead it induces a greater apathy and lack of attention towards others.
Well, what you're describing is an entirely caricature of determinism. It's true that the Nazis, for example, took certain ideas of survival of the fittest in support of their horrible ideology. But if you look at, what that actually means in the context of evolution, it's not what they were arguing for. You mentioned the natural kingdom. Yes, it's true that we see, animals eat each other, okay, and that does take place. But you're also ignoring the fact that we also see altruistic behavior in the animal kingdom. We see sparks of altruism in the animal kingdom. It's an entire field called evolutionary psychology, where it's not just one way or the other. By survival of the fittest, it's not just meant that which is the strongest that can subjugate everybody else. This is a misrepresentation of what we actually see in science. Collaboration is extremely useful in species surviving and passing on their genes. So I don't think that the way you're describing determinism is accurate. I think when we look at the types of mental states that can result through empathy, through working with others, through caring about other people, whether, even removing free will from the equation, that, could be enough to steer society farther away from what you've just described. I think what you're saying would make sense if all we were was, if there was no phenomenological and psychological consequences of immoral behavior. But those things are there, and psychology shows us this, phenomenology shows us this. These things are there, just some people maybe don't recognize it. But yeah, I mean, for that question, my perspective is that I think you're describing determinism inaccurately. And while I agree that there have been cultures that have misrepresented these concepts in order to serve their agenda, that's not a problem for the reality of the thing. That's.
I think that though, what that sounds like to me, you can correct me, but what that sounds like to me is that's not real socialism. That's what, like, as far as that rationale sounds to me, that same exact thing of that, well, but if we just tried it again, that it would work out this time. And the thing is, like you say, like, as far as the moral implications of behavior among humans and stuff like that, like, those things are there. And I would say the reason those things can be taken for granted as far as charting human behavior in the future is compatibilistic free will. Now,
I see no reason to. I see no reason to accept that.
And you would disagree, and I granted, like, you would disagree with that, but you don't have a justification other than that, because of the fact that when we look at society, like, if you look at other social creatures, we love to look at, like, let's say primates, ants, other organisms that display social characteristics similar to or on par with humans, but they also are incredibly violent towards one another as well. I mean, chimpanzees and dolphins, and like, they exhibit the exact same things that you would say are unacceptable human behaviors: rape and incest and gang violence, all these things that we would say that that's not morally acceptable, but they're being dictated by their genes alone. They don't have something humans have to tell them to not do those things. And when you insert human influence into their environments, they tend to not do those things, like controlled environments, like museums and zoos and places like that. They tend to not do those things because they have a human limiting influence to prevent them from doing so.
The difference is in our ability to self. No, the difference is in our ability to self-reflect on these things. What they lack is a capacity to, they don't have the same level of developed consciousness that we do. You said I lack a justification, but I think the justification is quite strong. I'm not claiming that we don't have those violent drives. Of course we do. So do animals. I'm not saying those things aren't there. I'm saying that that's not the full story. I'm saying that in a deterministic worldview, you have both, and you have good evidence and good reasons as to why what we would call moral is useful for our well-being. It's necessary for our preservation, despite the fact that you can point to these horrible behaviors as being part of what we are. You're only telling one side of the story and then saying, well, this is what determinism is.
Well, but the thing
it's a
is,
much
you're
more
only
complex
telling one
thing.
side of the story just as much. Because
No, I'm aware. I'm
like,
acknowledging there's two. I'm acknowledging
Yeah.
there's both. I'm not saying that.
well, no,
I'm
I'm
saying
saying that, like, on determinism, you have the physical drives, like a person wanting to have sex with an individual, whether they're rebuffed or not. But you can't, under determinism, you can't justify a reason to not do so.
Of course I
Whereas
can.
free will can determine, like,
No.
it's over here on this other side, but compatibilism that justifies both the reason to rape and the reason to not rape as equal, and the person
Absolutely.
has the freedom to choose between them.
Absolutely not, and here's why. Because when looking at phenomenology, when looking at psychology, that's all the justification we need to show why those behaviors are detrimental, not just to the victim, but to the perpetrator as well. I think it's a completely false claim to say that on determinism we have reasons to do both. We can understand what leads to both situations. That's a different thing than saying we have justifications to do both. That's a very different claim. I'm not saying that at all. You can look at determinism, you can recognize that when performing a certain behavior, the consequences, phenomenologically speaking, on our consciousness, the suffering it causes, for both parties involved, is all we need to look at to undermine those behaviors. And nowhere in that chain, in looking at those consequences, do I need to assume free will to be a factor. The assumption by people who on the religious side of things, and not just, but most often, is that outside of religion, anybody can do what they want because morality is subjective, and you can hurt somebody, and if that's your way to feel well-being, that then you're justified in pursuing that. But psychology tells us a very different story. The people that do harm are also doing harm to themselves. This is quite clearly shown in both psychological studies and looking at the phenomenology of experience. The fact that most people that do violence are often victims of violence. You don't see these people as being well-adjusted, happy, functioning people. Often people that do harm are incredibly unhappy and reacting to their situation in destructive ways. So I just think that
you can make an honest argument in psychology and that actually people who are the, like you say, the violent offenders are not less human, that they're not functioning less like a human being, especially if you take a materialistic worldview where humans are just more advanced, developed animals than other animals. Like, you can make a very strong argument that they're actually acting more human, that it's the social limiting factors like empathy, psychology, which like psychopathic individuals tend to not have as strongly as other individuals, and people with psychopathic and sociopathic traits tend to be more likely to offend than people who don't have psychopathic, sociopathic trends. That they're acting in a more consistently carnivorous, predatory, mammalian aspect than the whoever it is on the street, that it accepts rejection well and goes on to the next candidate type, like that they're actually being more consistent with natural driven biology than the one who isn't.
I think that's demonstrably false, because sociopaths and psychopaths pick up a very low percentage of the population. Most of us have a capacity to experience certain states of phenomenology that are entirely entirely connected with empathy and the kind of suffering that we would experience through doing harm and through experiencing harm. I think you're only looking at animals as being just predatory, and where I think in reality the conversation of nature, both human and otherwise, is far more complex and contains our ability to work with others, experience well-being in harmony with others, and the need to support behaviors that will lead to those experiences. I don't want to, because there are other questions that I want to ask you, so I don't want to get just stuck on this one thing. But for anybody listening, and I'll send you some of the resources I looked at as well, examine evolutionary psychology. Examine what phenomenology has to say in terms of the moral question. Because I think, what you've described, I think is a false depiction or an incomplete depiction of determinism and naturalism and nature as a whole. You're not paying attention to certain factors that do make a difference. I don't disagree with you that there are, that there is violence, that we have those dark parts of us. But you can't ignore an entire other part of what we are, and then claim that those things are unnatural. You have to look at the consequences of behavior on consciousness, and I think that's important when talking about morality.
Well, I think like a lot of things come down to emphasis, and what I think the major difference is, where we're the most distance between where you and I land on this, is what we emphasize as indicative of the majority. When I watch Animal Planet, when I watch Discovery News, when I watch those kind of shows, I see a lot of animals hurting other animals because it's biologically advantageous for them to do so. And then when I look at society out here, I see a lot of people that hurt other people because it's financially, or it is professionally, or it is sociologically, or whatever. It's advantageous for them to do so. I see both of those things as true, and the only things that limit them are the assumptions of free will that are the bedrock of the justice system and the kind of like social shunning systems that we use in order to limit those behaviors. Like, for instance, Jeff Bezos. People are upset with the very idea of Jeff Bezos because of the amount of money he makes, because they assume that it's predatory. If you assume that it was predetermined that he would make the amount of money that he would always make because of the decisions that he has made, and that that you don't have an argument. It's just jealousy, envy, any of those kind of things. It's that, quite frankly, there's no reasonable argument to say, well, what he's doing, or what fill in the blank serial killer, Ted Bundy's been popular lately, was wrong to do what they were doing, because it's brought them joy, it's brought them prosperity, it's brought them peace, it's brought them, like, anything that you say, like, well, it's why, like, I guess the major question is, between our worldviews, like, that you obviously value more, like, what benefits society as a whole, right? Like, what benefits I think us collectively. But,
I think it's a balance. It's a balance between the individual and the society. And my perspective is that your depiction of reality, which is that doing those predatory behaviors will result in the same peace and well-being, prosperity, and all these things, I think is factually unsupported by the science, by the psychology, and by the phenomenology that we have available. I think it's actually quite the opposite. Now, why is it that people that have someone like Trump that has billions of dollars, why is it that he displays completely miserable characteristics of pure unhappiness? Why is it that once you, I mean, again, people can look at the studies. It's been shown that once you hit a certain amount of income to where you can be said to be comfortable, you don't have to worry about, losing your house. More and more money, billions of dollars, don't make you more happy. If anything, what the opposite has been shown, which is when people just make money their obsession, it causes them quite the opposite. It causes them to feel empty. It causes them to feel miserable. So I just think that your depiction of these things is inaccurate to the facts that we have available. And I would be happy for you to come back and maybe discuss this part in more detail. And I'll send you some of the studies that I've looked at as to why I think your depiction of this is just actually incorrect. And maybe in an upcoming episode, I'll provide some links, or maybe even on this one, for people to take a look at as to why I think you're just factually, I think, incorrect in your description. But there were two other things that I did want to get to, and so I
was gonna butt in real quick and say that I thought that was productive, but yeah, if you guys want to switch on to the other things, the other topic, but Jeff, if you want to conclude that last section with a statement, we try to give at least our guests a last statement if they like. If not, no worries, but it's there. I'll pop out. So if you want to start with an ending closing statement and then move into that, or if you guys feel you need to hash more stuff out, it's all up to you.
Okay, I think one thing about it is with the way things are, like, let's say it like this: the presupposition for almost all human psychological studies is that there is a balance between society and the individual, but it almost exclusively favors the society versus the individual. That's why you put a person who with an aberrant morality or an aberrant social or psychological conditioning, you put them into prison, quarantining them, keeping society safe from them. And so we have a worldview map that's shaped by society or like the health and the safety and the security of society, us as a collective organism, is more valuable, more important, which I don't necessarily disagree with. I think that that's good in most instances. However, you can't negate the fact that that also shapes how people value the results of those studies as well, whether that's you're reading something from Christian theologians on the matter of free will and morality and all those things, or if you're talking about something from a secular mindset on that same subject. Putting society first means that in a lot of instances, the individual has to give up certain privileges or priorities or investment or whatever it is that they value, right? But we've conditioned ourselves to think that. You take that as a presupposition without a whole lot of challenging, and then data based on it reaffirms that idea a lot. And so if we're talking about a deterministic worldview, we've predetermined that we would value that. However, the person that is that aberrant psychology, aberrant morality, whatever it is that they are, they don't hold those same values. And on determinism, apart from authoritarian control, there is no way to tell that person that they are objectively wrong in believing that way.
So I don't want to take your last word away, but I do need to address that to some degree. I don't think it's a presupposition I'm making. I think it's an observation of phenomenology that I'm addressing. So I don't think it's actually a matter of how the society shapes anything. I think it's a matter of what the nature of phenomenology is and what can be observed in that context. Number one. Number two, while I agree with you to some degree that there are instances of tension between the individual and the society, they're far less than what people assume. I think often actually what's beneficial to one is beneficial to the other. Even in the context of serial killers, I think they recognize the value of certain certain social agreements for their own self-preservation, even if then they try to subvert it for their own needs. I think they recognize the value in it overall. And I'll just say what I said before. I think, I think we disagree on where the facts are pointing to, and I think that you're not recognizing the role of phenomenology in this conversation and why that can be used as a justification of the things I'm saying. Maybe we'll have you back maybe to just discuss this one issue for the whole time, because I think it is important. For the time being, I urge everybody to examine these questions on their own. Look up things like evolutionary psychology. Look up, morality in the context of phenomenology, in consciousness. What the studies that have been done, not based on assumptions, but based on simply observations as to how serial killers function in society and experience life every day. What is their experience of the world, and whether or not they can be said to be happy in the same way that we could attribute to other people.
Right.
So.
And I think it's worth noting as well, maybe we'll have this be my last word on the subject, that I am totally open to hearing more data. Like I said, I just finished a book. I have Audible, and so I work 11-hour shifts. So I'll go through a whole book in one shift at times. So I consume data, or I consume information at a little bit more higher rate than I think a lot of people do. So I'm totally open to diverse perspectives on all these concerns. Like I have changed a lot just in, like, when you start a book versus where you get to the end credits, like it tends to shape. And I started that at the beginning, talking about how, like, my mindset has, like, all humans have kind of a recency bias on that. And so I've seen more recently Freedom of the Will by A.W. Tozer, things like that, and seeing interviews with serial killers by theists and stuff, and all those things are great. And so I'm definitely open to new data, and just feel to review it. Any books you can recommend,
sure.
I'll
Absolutely.
do my best to pick those up. And I'm more than willing. Like, this is one of those issues, like, I've careened kind of wildly about it simply because it's not inherent to a Christian worldview, and so there is more room to play with it and to adjust and adapt. So anything you got, I'll review it for sure.
Sure. The next question I want to ask you, and I don't think this will take us long, it's on because there's something that I want to leave at the end that I think is one of the main reasons why I asked you to come on here. But the second part of this is what the conversation we've had about the nature of evidence, where you've claimed that all evidence is in a sense anecdotal. And so the perspective of the scientist or the atheist that is not convinced by the anecdotal evidence of Christians, they're being somehow, I can't think of the word, they're hypocritical, because ultimately all evidence is anecdotal. And now I want to respond to that, because I think it's a misrepresentation of the process, because nobody's claiming that obviously everything that we come to terms with and can derive evidence from happens through experience. Okay, of course. But the difference between what we would call anecdotal evidence and empiricism or other types of things is that in an anecdotal testimony, we lack the amount of data and the ability to replicate the experience and test the experience, have predictive power in terms of what we're going to say about the said experience. It's a different framework than that of science, which, yes, to some degree, it's a person talking about the experience of the experiment. But we have things like peer review. We have things like, we have a collective amount of data that goes far beyond a singular description that then can't be verified in any continuous way. If you want to say that science doesn't provide absolute certainty, I absolutely agree with you. I think science provides us with the most reasonable models of reality that we can point to and say, given the tools we have, this is the best we got in terms of understanding how things work. But living that open-minded, living it open-ended with, I'm not going to claim that, theory X is true in the absolute sense of the word. And I've seen you point to things like the problem of what was it? You claim there is a problem in science of reproducing studies, and you referred to that as some kind of crisis. I forget the name of it, right?
Okay, so here, I think I can interject right there. That my issue, so for viewers, maybe if you have TikTok, I did a series on this specific subject. It was almost a month ago, and TikTok doesn't have a very long memory, so it's been kind of buried already. But specifically talking about the subject of anecdotal evidence, and that's the title that I used. But it's actually not about evidence at all. It's actually on the nature of sources. And it's based on this, of that, I think you probably can agree with me on this specific point, regardless of that 9 out of 10 people, popular level people, who read, let's say, a study on chemistry, quantum physics, or whatever, if they actually read the study, which most people don't, but if they actually read the actual published study by whoever researcher at CERN, they have no idea what they are reading. They have no idea what they're talking about. They have no idea what the equations mean. They don't know. And so they're relying not on the evidence as it's presented. They're relying on the scientist's conclusion that that evidence does mean what the scientist is claiming about it, right? So with limited.
I agree with that. I agree with that, but I don't think it's the full story.
No, and I'm getting there too. So
okay.
Where I was mainly talking about more than that is that most people, even let's say 9.5, 9.9 out of 10, so 99 out of 100, they don't read the studies. They read National Geographic, they read Popular Mechanics, they read Popular Science, they watch Discovery Channel specials they watch the Netflix documentary on CERN, they watch popularly produced and directed level sets or presentations of information. And this is a problem that I see, like Christians, theists, everybody, they all do it, of that they listen more to, I'll pick on Christians for a second, they listen more towards like Frank Turek than they do William Lane Craig, or they listen more for like they listen for buzz names, like I don't know, Christopher Hitchens said, or Richard Dawkins said, or Francis Collins said. They listen for buzz names and buzz words more often than they actually read the actual content of printed material. And as a result, whenever, like, TikTok is one of the more challenging platforms to have actual conversations on because it's so pithy and it doesn't even order posts in the correct order a lot. Right. Like they're all mixed up. It makes it difficult to really have a good conversation or a linear conversation. But for the most part, when I see somebody where they say, I can cite this, I can cite that, my eyes kind of roll, specifically on the internet. Like my eyes kind of roll because of the fact that even if they do have a citation, a link to a website or a link to something, it's usually not a scientific source. It's a popular level article on something that some scientists produced. It's usually not an actual It's not an academic source. That's the main thing that I was getting at.
So I can agree with you, certainly, that there is a problem with education in this country and elsewhere, to where, there's also a problem of time, because, none of us are in a position where we can be experts on every single field, okay? And I agree with you that on all sides of the spectrum, often people will talk about things that they don't have a really good understanding of. But there are some differences here, because it seemed to me like you were sort of comparing the science aspect of it and the religious aspect to say, well, look, this is all the same type of evidential and issues with sources. Here's the main difference from my perspective. One is that, with science, we see certain kind of results that are much more clear and concrete and give us a reason to trust the science more than other contexts. Now, I agree that, I urge anybody to not just accept any scientific claim just, in principle, but to put in the time and the research and look at academic sources and do that sort of thing. The difference is, verifiability. Science works and is verifiable in a way that, other ideologies aren't, as far as I'm concerned. And I think that is the distinction. Yes, to some degree, I'm not going to be able to understand physics the way that my brother does, for example, because he's a physicist. I'm never going to have that grasp on the field the way that he does. But, I do my best to educate myself and, as much as I can. And I trust the methodology because I understand the methodology to be something that is trying to eliminate bias to the best of its abilities. Now, there are times where it fails, it's imperfect. There are particular scientists, which I think pervert to the system and aren't motivated by an honest approach to understanding reality and that kind of thing. So I'm not saying that it's this sort of perfect thing, but I do think it's disingenuous to compare it to what is taking place in religion and say, oh, we're kind of all doing the same thing. There's a difference in verifiability that I think is important to recognize. But I agree with you with one general claim that most often people talk about things they don't understand, and that's a problem.
And I that's one of the issues that I see a lot of. Specifically, I mean, because this is obviously not the first time I've had a conversation with an atheist about this subject, that subject, whatever subject. And I see, it's one of those things where it's easy to kind of turn your brain off because you hear a lot of the same things to assume that this person is just regurgitating something they've heard. And so you don't really give it the credence every single time that it necessarily deserves. But it's something that I see is that the reason what I was saying is this, is that if you have a scientist at, I don't know, a Hubble telescope that's guiding, taking pictures of the sky out there, they take a picture of something and then they publish that photo. And then they talk about what they saw or what that discovery means or whatever it is. You then take the person who's talking to me on TikTok about it might be up to 4 or 5 different layers of subjectivity away from that photo being taken and the original purpose and intent that the photograph was being taken and so forth. And so person sees that and well, that's evidence that there's aliens off in some other planet in that galaxy that's light years and light years and light years away. They're like, well, no, it probably doesn't mean that. But the thing is, because the person read the article, which they probably didn't even do that, they just read the headline that came up on their Facebook profile, right? They probably didn't even do that. But let's say they did. They read the article by Reuters or whoever it is, and now they assume that they're an expert on that specific piece of data because they read, like, that drives me crazy. And so that's one of the largest things that I was responding to. And the fact that that's the basis of 99.9% of debate on the internet. That somebody, because they read one article with one source one time, now they're an expert on something and they're impervious to criticism. And that, like, obviously, like, that goes for people on every side of every aisle, of course. But that's really frustrating for me. But the fact is that when you're dealing with debate on that level, that's the same. If you think, like, keeping in mind that Christianity is not new, that it's been around for, at the very least, about 1900 years. We're talking, like, it's been around for a while. We have literal centuries of philosophy of religion and things like that. There's layers upon layers of people that are smarter than anybody current on this chat that have been thinking about and discussing these things in various ways. That there's a lot more to be discussed. There's a lot more robustness to Christianity. And just to say that, well, it's all anecdotal in the Bible is not a good argument. And especially given the current atmosphere of secular criticism that I encounter, it's not super provocative either.
Yeah, so a few things. I mean, for the most part, what you said, I'm in agreement with you on, with the exception that, again, I will say that there is a different level of verifiability in the context of science that you're ever going to find in the context of religion, which I think makes a world of difference with how we value the evidence produced and how we value the people giving us the evidence, so on and so forth. Now, often, how would I say this? I've looked at, what you would probably call more deep level of arguments for Christianity, that go beyond, because you're talking about, most often the secular criticism you run into isn't that interesting or profound. Well, it's because most people that we're dealing with are not the scholars that have perhaps more interesting things to say about it, but people who have no understanding of what evidence is even remotely, and are arguing by saying, well, I know God is real because the Bible tells me so. If those are the conversations we're having, because these are the people that we're dealing with, I would be happy to have a scholar come on here and have a more interesting conversation. But that is not the majority of society in this context. But again, verifiability is the key here. Science has a capacity to be verified in a way, even with all the problems you mentioned, which I agree with you on. Certainly, how we interpret what we're reading can be problematic. But it possesses something that I think metaphysical ideologies don't have. And I think that's, with all the problems that you want to point to science having, which I may agree with you on, it has something that these other approaches don't have. But I'm glad that at least we can find common ground more or less on that issue. My problem is when people say, well, why are you dismissing the anecdotal evidence of people saying that they saw Christ resurrect, as though that should be convincing. And their approach is, well, you accept, what scientist X says, so why aren't you accepting what theist X says? Where to me, it's like there's a big difference between somebody reporting that they went to a political rally and saw, Biden give a talk, as opposed to go to a political rally, see Biden give a talk, and then claim that they saw him levitate and fly around the arena. Those two claims are not the same, and they shouldn't be viewed as the same. The testimony in defense of those claims, one needs far more evidence in support for me to believe in such a claim than the latter. That's my perspective on that. Are you okay with moving on to the next part? I mean, feel free to make a last comment.
Was somebody about to? No, okay. So
No,
I think,
go ahead.
yeah, I think one of the things about it is that at the most basic level, every claim is either true or false, right? I think we can agree about that. Everything is either true or false, and there's some gradient of that. Like, let's say if someone makes a false statement, but somebody then reports accurately that false statement, it's like there's that gradient of like it's true and
Sure.
false at the same time, right? And so when we're talking about specifically in this context where we're talking about a competition of sources, because a lot of times this ends up devolving into a little bit of an arms race of who can get the most sources on their side and who,
Right.
but the thing is, if it's true, it really doesn't matter how many people are dissenting on the opposite side. If something is true, it remains true, even if people disagree, even if it's uncommon. Like, for instance, the
Sure.
likelihood of the Patriots beating the Atlanta Falcons and overcoming a 28-3 deficit in the Super Bowl is like that big, but they still did it. The fact is that even though it was a slim to none chance, like, it still happened. So society is not always probabilistic. Yes, like, and using the example present with like, is it very likely that Joe Biden was able to levitate? No. But even if it's unlikely, that doesn't inherently make it false. And I think what you're getting at there is that it's the extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The thing about it is that if the Bible is true, like if like, because these are the documents that we have, if it's true, it's true. And like, you can dismiss it of like, well, it's a miracle claim, so it's unlikely. Being unlikely doesn't make it false either. It just makes it still unlikely.
Right. Okay, but here's why this is a bad argument. Because I agree with you that no one here is claiming that we know anything to be false. Okay, I would never make the claim that I can disprove God or I can disprove that a resurrection took place. Okay, I have no certainty of anything being the case. It's not about what is true or false. This is about how can we be justified in making claims and having a belief, because neither of us can have the certainty of what happened or didn't happen. Okay, of course, something being unlikely doesn't mean that it didn't happen, but it certainly means that it's less reasonable to believe than something that we can test over and over and have more evidence for. I'm not claiming that just because something doesn't have, how would I say this? You'll never hear from me claims of certainty of what is possible. What I care about is epistemology. So how can we go about supporting an idea that maybe the Bible is true? Or how can we go about supporting the idea that evolution is probably true? We can't express certainty. We can only look at, what our justifications are and what the evidence is. And from my perspective, we arrived at the conclusion that while I can't disprove anything, I can reasonably say that religious claim X or religious claim Y is unlikely, or that I don't have good reasons to take them as true. There's a big difference there, because look, any atheist that may come to you and say, I know that a resurrection didn't happen, or that I know God doesn't exist, I will dismiss them entirely, because I don't think that that's an approach they could reasonably take. But we can't prove or disprove anything with certainty. I could list you a million things that you couldn't disprove or have no reason to believe or accept. So there's a big difference there. To just say, well, if the Bible is true, well, what reasons do you have to make that assumption? That's the key problem. It's we can play the game with anything. If X is true, then Y. But what reasons, justification do you have to accept that premise X is true? That's the key problem. So I mean, that's how I would, I agree with you and disagree at the same time.
Right. And I think that's interesting that we do have a lot of common ground there. And it's
Which I'm
encouraging to
surprised
hear you say
about.
that you would dismiss someone who just said that they have proof that God doesn't exist, because man, I hear that so much. Oh my goodness. It's such a frustrating thing to deal with, of that I can prove. And it always frustrates me that argument that kind of goes back and forth of that prove God exists versus prove God doesn't exist. That's a frustrating kind of realm, I guess, or an atmosphere of debate, because it's so inherently hostile. But
it's also completely delusional. I mean, I don't need to disprove a claim that is unfalsifiable or that you haven't provided evidence for, and vice versa. I mean, nobody needs to disprove anything. We just, what is the evidence for the claim you want to make? That's all we need.
Right. Well, I think additionally, there are lines that you can pursue that of the historical manuscripts. We can discuss, one of the things that I think that atheists tend to use as a little bit of a club is in this, I guess this atmosphere is treating science as a monolith when it's not one. It's something that really frustrates me is when people's like, but science says nothing. It doesn't say anything. It doesn't have any opinions about anything. It doesn't exist. That's not a real thing. There are scientists, and scientists come to conclusions. And in some ways, they're using that as like a syllogism or a synonym for like peer review. But I think like it misrepresents the in a large way, like kind of fractious realm that science actually tends to be. It also downplays how scientific data is reported. It's something that I've talked about before, of that scientists that can't get negative data published, that journals refuse to redact I guess falsified research, and then like things like that, of that they're like the metadata and the meta analysis of studies showing that there's tons and tons of actual diversity of thought in actual scientific laboratories, but it's just underreported. And so there's a lot of people that I interact that they don't even realize how, I guess, diverse the scientific opinions truly are. And that if you can't get your book published, or if you can't get Oxford or Cambridge to publish your study, then that you get deplatformed. And then even the publishers and free presses, they're using that as a way to kind of muffle and silence data from that counter or contradicts kind of dominant narratives. So
I'm going to push back on some of this to some degree, because first of all, by science we mean a certain type of methodology. It's not just individual scientists doing whatever. By science we mean the tool we're using to model reality. Now, I can agree with you that, like with anything, science is imperfect, and there are those times where you'll have problems with the way things get published or funded, even how certain research is funded as opposed to other research. You have scientists that are dishonest and are trying to like hide certain results, or that does happen, but that is, I think, a vast minority of what actually takes place. I would say that science is the best methodology we have to determine what is the case, and I do think that more often than not, science is operating the opposite of what you just described, where people are trying to prove themselves. Scientists get points for proving themselves wrong, and proving each other wrong. And I think I don't think there is as much of a difference in opinions as you're describing it, although I think there is some, and although I do agree that there are some problems with the way that things are handled sometimes. it's not to. I don't think it's anywhere near to the degree that you're claiming. I would be, I think, more comfortable seeing you have this particular aspect of the conversation with someone who's a scientist than perhaps myself, because I do acknowledge that I am no expert in this field, and I'm sort of more far removed than maybe even I think Mike has.
Oh, he said my name and it cursed him.
What?
He said my name and it cursed him.
Oh,
is he frozen? Is it just me or is he's frozen?
It.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, he might have cut out on the internet. Okay. Well, man, if I would have known what he was agreeing with specifically there before he said it, I would be able to chime in on that. Yeah, no, we'll get him back on. I'll remove him from the thing and see if I can't.
Okay.
Yeah, it went black. Hopefully he's not having an issue there. Though this is a productive conversation. I want to kind of give everybody up to date. We had Matt Slick was supposed to be coming on the show about a week or two ago, and I don't know if I really got to explain to people what happened. He was under the weather and had to reschedule. I still haven't heard back from him, so hopefully we hear back from him, but that is still planned. I also just got done talking to a bunch of different people on Facebook earlier, that some professors of philosophy. So we'll be having some people come on talk with Cease and some people to talk about the Bible as well. Jeff, would you be willing to come back and talk more scripture with me?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because that's more my bread and butter for sure.
Okay. Do you have any specific thing that you want to talk about on that? That's kind of general.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, we could talk about. I'd really like to see what you think about editorial fatigue or docile reproduction, and things like how we come to the nature of knowing Markan priority, whether or not you agree Mark comes first. Not like the typical contradiction type of thing that I feel like most atheists want to get into, but more so editorial techniques that the way that we look at these kind of linguistic techniques and see how things have changed and who would come first, or we could even go into the resurrection, things like that, whatever you'd prefer.
Yeah, I'd have to dust off some of my older, I had to unbox some of my books for that, but I guess as kind of a mindset. So I work in distribution, and of course the holiday season is coming up, and so unless you have something that's really that you really want to press on soon, or you have a schedule specifically, it might have to wait till mid-December, depending.
No worries. A lot of people are kind of back, hey, I can't do it now and stuff like that, and that's fine. So I'll deal with the problem of having everybody come at me at once and be like, hey, I could do the show now, and then I'll be overloaded. But there's one thing I wanted to say. I think Cease is getting back in here, but there's one thing I kind of wanted to say real quick about the evidence thing, and maybe that'll kind of get you, if you guys remember your point, or Cease if you remember your point. But I didn't know if you guys maybe wanted to touch upon the nature of being able to verify things. And you said that science is on this monolith, which I'm not sure if I fully understand what you mean by that, but I was curious on whether or not you think that there is some credibility for people to cite these things because of the falsification criterion that it provides and things like that. But Cease, if you want to not lose your thought, you can go ahead with what you were last.
Well, first of all, can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, it sounds like your mic actually is a lot better.
So I'm an idiot because I didn't realize that my microphone wasn't plugged in. I was using these the whole time, and I thought I plugged it in. Sorry about that, guys.
That's my producer's fault because I couldn't tell the difference, and usually I should be able to, but these headphones I can't tell the difference really.
My Wi-Fi is really bad, and so sometimes it will occasionally cut out.
My phone off of Wi-Fi, and it's running just on data right now, in order to kind of keep the connection up. So I don't know if it's just a weather or something that's going on, or something, or what.
Yeah. Well, I'll let you guys get right back into that, and then we'll. But I do think that if you guys can at one point, and I don't want Cease to lose his thought, but I do want to see what you think about things being verified and the falsification criteria, and why people kind of put science up into that stratosphere, as you say, because of its reliability. And,
yeah, that's the thing.
Yes,
Right?
but I didn't want to cut you off. See,
well, that's exactly what I was going to say. Is that the difference is in the level of verifiability that we can attest to, and the level of what it can predict, the detail and the precision which science can, when it's functioning the way that it should be, provide, and also the tools that it produces. Now, again, I agree with you that there are times where science fails to live up to what it's supposed to be, and you get those problems. I don't deny that, but I don't think that happens as much as you're saying it does. And yeah, that's basically what I would say to that.
Well, there's a couple of things present here that I contest specifically. I can agree a lot with what you were just saying, but contesting specifically with because a person has a PhD in X field, they are then qualified to speak on this other field they're not educated in directly. Like,
sure.
For instance, Stephen Hawking talking about philosophy. Like, obviously, I mean, Stephen Hawking, an incredibly gifted cosmologist, right? Mathematician, all of that. But that doesn't necessarily equate to him understanding the philosophy of religion, the philosophy of things like that. Like, and
of course not, yeah.
And something that frustrates me a lot is that specific thing of like, didn't you hear what Stephen Hawking said about God is dead, or about this, about that? Like, if it's not in their field, then they should not be treated as anything more than a layman in this other field. Or if that's Richard Dawkins being an evolutionary biologist and then trying to speak on the nature of psychology, or Sam Harris being a neuroscientist trying to talk about the philosophy of morality. Like, they can have their opinions, of course. They can have their opinions, and that's fine, but they should not be treated as authoritative.
So hold on a second, because I was right with you until you mentioned Sam Harris, because Harris is actually a philosopher first and a neuroscientist second. At least from my understanding of his work, even though, yes, his books are more for the masses, and so he doesn't go into a lot of detail the way that he would with, in a different context. I think he's extremely well prepared, philosophically speaking, because I've seen him in conversation with people that know what they're talking about, as opposed to, I actually think that. So I was just gonna say, I think in the terms of the moral sphere, I think he has a lot of valuable things to say, and I think he, I don't like the term authority.
Right, and like certainly, and the idea is that I'm kind of planning towards is the idea of, now obviously just because a person has a PhD in, let's say, philosophy doesn't make them an expert in philosophy either. Like, obviously, like, it is important to note that just because a person is trained as well, or if someone is a legal scholar, doesn't make them, and our society as well, and the scientific community, the various fields of scientific research are so niche and they're so kind of compartmentalized that even if a person has a degree in, let's say, political science, doesn't necessarily make them an expert in specifically constitutional democracy or something along that line. Like, because of how precisely tuned everything has become, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it makes it so that it's difficult to gauge where a person's actual level of credibility is, especially from the popular level. We tend to be kind of glamorized, I guess, or seduced by the glamour of person with a PhD or person sitting in the, I don't know, the Socratic chair in Oxford. We see a name and then we assume that everything they're saying is sage advice. And I think that our society as a whole needs to kind of mature a bit into seeing that people are people. And everything like what we were talking about in the determinism, free will, compatibilism conversation applies to this realm as well, of that, are we sure that a person checked all of their biases and all of their presuppositions at the door before doing their research? And if they're a good scientist, they'll be pretty precise about the hypotheses they made, the assumptions, and the those things that they made. But we also recognize that they can't be 100% certain that they've categorized everything that they were thinking as they were coming into this. And the more nuanced a field is, like psychology and psychiatry, studying things like the mind and the brain and things that are very, very very new, very adolescent stage levels of research, that honestly, if you're getting updates, which I don't know if anyone is, but if you're getting updates on things like neuroscience and neuropsychology every few days, like people are publishing papers and they tend to kind of contradict each other because simply, I mean, sample size and research categories and all those things that impact the way a person studies specific things and the way they accumulate their data sets and the way that they apply those data sets and how those things are influenced by things like their funding matrices and their publishing matrices, like all that stuff, like all those things are really heavily, like significantly influential. And I think especially when we're talking about debating things on the internet with other layman level individuals, I haven't seen a whole lot of people giving credence to those kind of interventional circumstances.
So let me,
what I'm really getting at.
So let me just say, everything you just said is extremely ironic to me, because I'm with you that just because you have a PhD behind your name doesn't mean shit. Okay, what matters is what you're actually saying. So I never just look at somebody's name and credentials and just say, therefore what they say is going to be true. Although I do think that they're more likely. No, I don't think anybody would claim that it's necessarily true, but I think they might be more likely to have, especially when they talk about their own field or have a PhD in their own field, they're more likely to be trusted than somebody who's outside of that framework, outside of academia, doesn't have the degree. But it's not about the degree. It's okay, because you have the degree, I might be more willing to listen to what you have to say, but then it still matters what it is you're saying, in the larger context. But here's why I don't understand. How are you a theist? Because everything you just described, you is very, it's essentially you're providing the skeptical framework as to why we should eliminate certainty, why we should be careful as to the sources we're looking at. And if everything you've described applies to science, which it should apply to everything, it applies even more to religion or to metaphysical claims or to claims about the supernatural. I don't understand how you can have this mindset, which I agree with you on, and then be religious. Because everything you just described is one of the main reasons why I reject, religion, is because I have that framework, and why I never claim certainty even in other fields. So it boggles my mind that there's sort of this strange duality in you where you can say everything you just said and then tell me that you're a Christian. It just doesn't make sense to me.
Well, there's a couple of really significant things here, and that scientific inquiry is a material approach to material circumstances. You can agree with that?
Sure.
Yeah. So
yeah.
The thing is, if we're talking about God specifically, not natural, and so as soon as if you think about it, there's a field with white lines all the way around it, and you can play on that field all you want. But as soon as you step on the white, you're no longer eligible for play, right? In the same way of that, science and the approaches of the scientific method, all those things, those are really great for categorizing and comprehending material, natural processes and matter as we are able to know it. But it cannot, it will never be able to categorize or to limit or to really comprehend things that are supernatural. And like I said, like I'm a compatibilist when it comes to free will, like all those things. Like it's something that, as much as science knocks on the doors and walls of that very finite barrier, it'll never be able to cross them. I'm a mind-body dualist as well. I believe that the consciousness and things, that those are not natural parts of the body, that they are separate but inhabit it. Like there's a lot of things that I believe in.
So that's another conversation for sure that we need to have, because
yeah.
I think mind-body dualism is incredibly philosophically, again, I mean, no disrespect, but I just think it's a failure.
Which is fine. Yeah, I had a feeling that you would. Because I think that as far as where we're kind of teasing out is that you're very material, and then I'm on the line. And if we watch, as we probably were to have more conversations on these subjects, that we see like there are certain areas where I'm more on the natural side, and there's certain areas where I'm more on the supernatural. So I'm kind of walking the fence in between them, because that there are certain things that even the most materialistic scientists would admit that they're beyond classification. And maybe that's like that they're not there yet is usually the argument that's made, that we're not there yet, but eventually we will. But when you make that claim, I don't know if there's an argument against the fact that that's a faith claim. That eventually you could say that it's historically retroactive, of that we've come this far, who knows how far we'll go beyond it, and I'm fine with that. But at this, like, I don't know if that's really enough to say that it's still not a faith claim.
So I actually think, and maybe this might surprise you, that I do believe there are certain questions science in principle can't answer. And this is due to different linguistic and subjective limitations that maybe we'll discuss when we talk about dualism another time. But it seems to me like your epistemology is inconsistent, because yes, you may be completely right that maybe there is a realm of existence outside of what we can perceive, okay? But then we have no way of talking about that, or we have no epistemology that we can apply to talk about whether or not that does exist, whether it should be believed, what that would look like. Even if you're right, there is such a thing. It just seems like you're using the correct epistemology and skepticism in the context of science, that then you're abandoning just because you're telling yourself that science doesn't, in principle, can't talk about X, which maybe it can't. But if science can't approach that question, we don't have any other tools that can. Is what I would say. And anything beyond that is going to be speculation. That is going to be that we don't have a legitimate epistemology we can apply to therefore say, well, there's a good reason to believe this or that. Even if I agree with you that science has its limitations in that category. It just doesn't make sense to me.
Well, I mean, as far as that's concerned, that only is true in a purely materialistic world. If the world is 100% unadulterated materialism, then yes, that is true. But if you insert God exists and he has the ability to interact, or what Bible Christians would say is reveal from his side of the veil, then that's no longer true. What it basically is like on debate.org, which I don't spend any time on because it's a waste of time, but on debate.org, one of the number one most debated subjects is whether or not Australia is real, which seems absurd if you're from Australia or you've been to Australia, but it is something people that have not been to Australia debate significantly. And if you think about it, because of the fact that the one source of information that I have that's most reliable or that I trust the most is my own intuition and sensory reception, right? And I think everyone would admit it, like it is possible to be fooled, and it is not always 100% valuable, but it is at the most basically like I have to trust my eyes, I have to trust my mind as interacting with things in a reliable manner. And I've never been to Australia. So if somebody makes an argument that Australia is not real, what do
I think there's a lot of
have? Like there are arguments, obviously, there is data that we can suggest that Australia is real. But let's say I happen to know someone personally who lives in Australia, who can tell me that he drinks a lot of Fosters and ropes kangaroos, that information that I've received from a personal entity in that realm is justifiably reason that I can make a justifiable conclusion on the basis of that, yes, Australia is real because I've spoken to an Australian.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, all those examples I think are, can make sense in the context of acknowledging we can have certainty, but how do we determine what is likely the case or reasonably true can be understood in the context of living in a global community with access to information. And yes, I mean, I can't be certain that you exist if you want to go down, sort of deconstructive. But do I have any good reason to assume that position as being reasonable? No, because there's a vast number of reasons why, that's not really justified. I think it's a cop-out or an evasion to say, well, all the tools we're using to be skeptical and be reasonable should only be applied in the natural system, but then it can be done away with just because now I'm going to decide that the immaterial is possible, and so I'm not going to apply the same epistemology. It just seems like inconsistent. That these tools that we use should only be used in the one context and not the other. But
not necessarily, because we do this all the time. The tools that are relevant and useful in terms of like psychology are not necessarily relevant or useful in chemistry. And the tools.
No, I don't mean that. I'm talking about a larger. In this context, I mean a larger conversation about knowledge, how it is that we derive knowledge, and from my perspective, where the approach to the material fails or is incomplete or whatever you want to call it, nothing else succeeds where that fails. And even if you were right in saying that it's maybe we're limited in the physical perspective, even your assumption in the non-physical, I think is ultimately flawed. I think we disagree in principle on what it is that can be said to be knowledge and how we can derive that. Because I don't think that, again, comes from the fact that you're a dualist and I'm a physicalist. Although I'm a non-reductive physicalist, so I'm not necessarily claiming that everything can be reduced to the physical in the it doesn't fully capture the phenomena. I just think that if there's a problem with talking about truth and talking about knowledge and then abandoning what I think are the tools that can provide us with those answers. We disagree in principle there. And I definitely want to get into more detail.
The assumption that I'm abandoning skepticism because, like, at the beginning of the show, I was talking about how, like, I started off over here, charismatic Pentecostal church that I went to was like chewing on the carpet, like that kind of thing that people make satirical comedy bits out of. and now I'm somewhere in the Reformed area, and I've been at various different times and different denominations. I've gone to different churches. I've been the only white guy in a black church. I've been the only white guy in an Asian church. Like, I've been all over the map at different times because of the fact that it's not that I've checked my brain at the door, and I don't think that that would be accurate. And it's not, and I don't think that's necessarily accurate for a lot of Christians or theists or atheists or anything like. I wouldn't categorize a lot of people that way. What I would say is that simply that there are specific tools that are relevant here, and there's specific. Like I have a Mustang, and it's been a pain in my neck since practically the day I bought it, because Mustangs are a pain in the neck. And so every single time something goes wrong with it, which is unfortunately often, I have to get new sets of tools. I was trying to take the alternator out a while back, and I snapped two sockets while I was working. Like that, I have to get new tools, and I have to repair old tools and stuff like that. And I have to do weird things in order to make things function the way that I know that it's supposed to function. And so that in the analogy I was using of that with like, if you think about something in a specific way, like one of the reasons critical race, critical gender theory, critical all these things exist now is that there's been ways to think about various things for decades and even centuries. Gender theory and race, and thinking about those specific things for literal generations. It's like, we want to think about it differently. We want to challenge those thoughts. And as a result, they're coming up with different tools. And that's why people that are traditionalists versus progressives tends to disagree so much, is that they're using fundamentally different sets of tools psychologically and kind of epistemologically to think about these issues. And I think that's the major thing between like a materialist versus or a dualist versus a physicalist, is that we are approaching it, the whole subject, we're approaching it with a different set of tools, and that's why the conclusions that we're coming to are so dynamically different.
In the context, yeah, I'm not sure that I agree with most of that. We would have to go into more of the detail.
Right. That's a whole. We need to have that conversation later.
But I will say that in terms of epistemology, I don't think there's different tools being used. I think when we're talking about truth and what is epistemically justifiable, the criteria is what it is, and then some things either fall within that or don't. And same thing with the scientific method. I don't buy this idea that we're approaching these questions of truth in entirely different ways. It seems to me not reflective of the facts. That again, I don't want to necessarily assume that, because I'm not sure what you mean by what the details of what you're describing is. But I have a real problem in terms of epistemology with saying that we can talk about truth and reality outside of the context in which we usually mean with verification and epistemology and these things. I think, you may be right in science having limitations, but I think you're incorrect in the belief that we can be justified in believing things beyond the material, and that we have, and we can apply an epistemology that will work, that will provide us reasonable beliefs in a different context. I think fundamentally that argument is flawed, and I think that is something that just that question will be another 2 hours.
Well, I think that one way we can resolve it maybe is this basic thing of that, because we agree that science can't really it can butt up against some of these these dualistic or supernatural questions, but it can't resolve them. And so
depends. I think depends on the question. Depends on the question.
It depends on the question. And so there's two conclusions you can draw from that, of that science can't define this because it's not real, or science can't define this because it's beyond science's jurisdiction.
There's another option there. There is. It could be because again, I'm not making claims of truth or false. Whether it's real or not. This is whether or not it's real or not real, may be beyond our capacity to discover. What I'm talking about is, what can we justifiably say through epistemology? It may be that science can't comment on certain things, and then those things may or may not be true independently of the fact that science can't comment. But we simply might not know or ever know whether or not that thing can be said to be real or not. So all we can look at is, well, what can we say, and how can we say it? Mm-hmm. That would be my response to that.
So what I would say is this: it kind of works like this. This is on the spot, but it's kind of like this: that science cannot say that God isn't real, or that supernatural things cannot occur. Can't say that. It's beyond its jurisdiction. So you can make the assumption like, but what if it is? Which is not an unfair question, but what if it is? And then Christian theism is the belief that God exists and has personal autonomy to interact and reveal himself. And so that's kind of the bridge between the two.
But
the short of that,
sure,
God does reveal himself. And so that's something I can do, that there's certain, I mentioned in my appearance on TART, is that there are certain things that I can't unsee. And that's not something that is very satisfying to someone. Like, as I've mentioned, like that I'm a skeptic by nature, and I believe that you are as well, that's not a very satisfying answer in some ways, but doesn't really matter because of the fact that you can't unsee it.
Yeah, but again, the what if it is, I think is a question that is unreasonable, given what can be said about our epistemic limitations, and personal testimony, when we can attribute explanations that we have more of a concrete evidence for, not to say that those explanations prove your belief false, but they at least give other possible options that seem more likely. I question the motivations behind someone holding certain religious ideas. I just want to move quickly because I know we don't have a lot of time left, but I need to bring this up. Mike, how much time do we have? Is Mike there? I don't know if he's there.
You have as much time as Jeff needs. I'm pretty good.
Okay, because this is something that I really need to address here. Because we had a conversation that, I'm going to be honest, I frankly took some degree of offense to. And this is in relation to the problem of evil. And, because look, I can agree with you, okay, that there are certain types of suffering that is necessary for character growth. Okay, but there are certain types of suffering that I think is very clearly, and this can again bring in psychology and phenomenology back into the picture, that we can very clearly observe doesn't serve a purpose. When we talked about cancer, right? And you made the claim that the reason people have a problem with cancer is not the pain it causes, physically, emotionally, the pressure on the families and otherwise, but it's because it's experienced as an inconvenience. That's what people are having a problem with. Now, look, it may be the case that there are those who go through those experiences and might say things like, I wouldn't change it because I learned a lot, which, whether or not that's, I don't think anybody wants to die from cancer. They might say that they've learned certain valuable lessons perhaps from it, but they would still want to survive it. I don't know what your exposure has been to people with diseases of that kind. I can tell you firsthand, okay, that is the trauma that I have gone through, seeing my own father die from cancer, is not an inconvenience there for me. It wasn't an inconvenience for him. These are things that had a severe emotional impact, a physical impact, a psychological impact in many different ways. And it's a type of suffering that I'm not satisfied with the answer, God is mysterious. And so we can't judge God, as to why he wouldn't step in, why he wouldn't alleviate children from cancer. To say that they may have learned something, or that their family learned something, or that there might be beauty in the closeness that people can come together in horrible experiences. None of that is enough for me for the question, for the problem of evil to be answered, because you can go through suffering in a context which you then can get past it and still have a life and still have things to learn. I don't buy that somebody gets raped and I'm supposed to think that, well, it's okay because God has a plan. And that to me is a complete cop-out. And you were mentioning earlier that my approach results in a lack of empathy. That determinism can be a source of a lack of empathy. But that statement from you, to me was quite sociopathic, to be honest with you. And I understand that over the internet in a short comment, things can come off the wrong way. I understand that it's I'm not necessarily judging you as a person based on one sentence. It's a larger conversation to have, and I'm not trying to attack you as a bad person or anything. But I'm asking you to reconsider some of the claims you've made in that context, because I don't get offended easily. Ultimately, I believe what I believe on the subject. But if you're trying to sort of communicate the idea that religion is about compassion, you're not going to do that by diminishing cancer to a a inconvenience. So I just have to let that out, and feel free to respond however you wish.
Okay. How much time do we have? Anybody? How much time do we have?
You have as much time as you need. I'm literally just trying to just do stuff for Axioms on while we're doing this, so I'm right here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. It's
sending out emails.
I know we're already over 2 hours, so I don't want to get super deep in it. Without,
I'm gonna start chopping these up. I'm gonna start chopping these up. I think Theology Unleashed might have been one of the people that I've messaged. I'm not sure, and I apologize. A lot of people I've saw from different conversations, so I might not know exactly what channel you're on, and I apologize for that. But yeah, I think Theology Unleashed is going to come on as well, and that'll be a show about the Izot problem. And I think Cease would enjoy that. I would love that as well, because
for sure.
I love Hume, but that's definitely the most interesting concept that I think is just pretty. I think it's just misunderstood from my perspective. But
okay, so in that, let me approach this a couple of ways. Is that I've being a youth pastor, children's pastor, associate youth minister, different things that I've done. I've experienced a lot of bedsides, and as well as my own personal family, cancer, Alzheimer's. I've experienced a decent amount of bedside circumstances, and I understand as far as kind of where your friction comes from, of the idea that that's a very sterile approach to what the experience of suffering, because I don't think we don't really have a problem of evil present in this. I know that like there's a problem of natural evil and real evil and different things. This specifically, just for clarity, this is the problem of suffering, which is separate as well from the problem of pain, because pain is not necessarily the whole encompassing experience of suffering. You can experience emotional or psychological suffering without a physical component. You also can experience physical pain without a necessarily emotional or a psychological aspect, right? So,
but it's a problem of evil in the sense that God allows it to be the case. It's evil in reference to the character of what God would be as a God that allows certain type of things to happen.
Right. But the thing is, this either does one of two things. It either over individualizes of, but what about my suffering, which negates like it hyper focuses in on a moment of a person's life rather than a longitudinal experience of a person's life, or it does the opposite thing of that it overgeneralizes, in that you have people that are saying like, where was God's purpose in that hurricane? Where was God's purpose? Where was God's purpose in this, that, some other thing? They'll overgeneralize because of the fact that, quite frankly, in some ways, it's specifically, or like maybe not intentionally, but maybe subconsciously for the purpose of evading getting pinned down on the issue of that. If you try to address a specific circumstance, they then zoom back out and start generalizing again. Or if you start speaking to the general issue of suffering, then they start precisely like magnifying in on this person or that person. You talk about children's cancer here, and you try to kind of edge someone into a corner about that, and then they move over to start talking about natural disasters. And like, it makes it so that it's impossible to have a meaningful conversation on the subject, because each one of those things has its own, honestly, it deserves its own specific addressment. But
I think
whether it's a natural thing or not.
But I think each example, although different and maybe different in the way in which we experience it to some degree, share the same problem, which is that there are certain type of experiences that you do not recover from. And maybe this goes back to the free will thing, where you think it's up to the individual to recover from X. But to me, I don't think it's about generalizing or narrowing down anything. I think that even when you can sort of derive something positive from a horrible experience, there are certain experiences that shouldn't take place, that do more harm than the potential good, or only do evil. So I know people that have went through, were raped, and it destroyed. There was no lesson there. There was no coming out of that a stronger person, or it was just a destruction of a person. And if I saw somebody about to get sexually assaulted, it would be my ethical duty to step in and prevent that from happening. And yet, I'm said to be made in God's image. God is said to be all loving and all powerful. But in that context, God lets it happen. And the answer is, it's okay, because God is mysterious. And how do we know God's real plan? It seems to me to be an approach that completely is impenetrable to criticism. You've just created a perfect fog that there's no way getting. To me, it's like the worst example of dogmatism, where if there is an all-loving God, He's not going to let somebody get raped. Like, it's just not going to happen. And Yeah, again, we can focus on the issue of cancer if you want, but I just
Well,
don't
here's
I don't
the thing.
understand.
Like, I think an important thing is that, so you said that there are certain things that just shouldn't happen, but I'm sure you recognize that that's your opinion. It's not an objective statement.
I think it can be said to be an objective statement in light of the results that those events have
But that's
resulted in.
either utilitarian
Sure.
or, like, I mean, because of the fact that the same, like, which is something that I had appealed to, is that the same circumstance can impact two different individuals in two precisely different ways. So that on one hand, it does end up being a life altering, destructive influence, and then another person ends up being this galvanizing, strengthening, and it's in some ways like, for a bad metaphor, is in comic books, or that for every explosive or devastating nuclear reactor explosion that turns somebody into a superhero, that same event usually ends up creating the villain, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, it's a way of that, through narrative, that we understand of that the same event can have a galvanizing or a destructive element. And it's, quite honestly, us as an observers, this is one of the things that suffering's not really an objective experience, it's a subjective experience.
Well,
of that
all experience is subjective, but we can understand it in objective terms.
Like there are objective ways that we can comprehend it, like, for instance, a pain scale, or like there are categorical ways to approach treatment and things. There are objective circumstances and influences there, but for the most part, it is penchant upon the individual of how they'll respond. And I think this does tie to the determinism conversation we were having earlier, of that you believe, you can correct me here, you believe that the outcome of a person's response, or let's say their rape, the outcome of a person's trauma will inevitably result in this or that, and they don't have a choice.
No. I'm saying, however, but no, because I don't know. They might come out of the trauma stronger, or they might come out of the trauma weaker. Regardless of the outcome, it will still be dependent on determinism. But I actually don't think that is relevant for the problem, because let's say that I assume free will exists. Okay, even though one experience may have actually helped a person, in the context in which it didn't help somebody else, and God is all knowing and God is all powerful, that person shouldn't have gone through that situation. Let me
clarify really quick. So what you're saying is, if two people experience the same event, this one gets stronger, this one doesn't, then why did God let it happen to this person? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and from my worldview, from a deterministic point of view, the fact that they dealt with it differently actually is not a problem for determinism, because the causes and effects and the people are different. So their difference in reaction can still be entirely determined by unauthorized causes that they're not choosing. So I'm not sure that the difference in experience proves free will for me, which is what I was trying to claim earlier. But yes, in this context, let's say free will exists. Aside from the fact that God cares about free will in the context of the problem of evil, but then doesn't care about free will in other parts in the Bible. So when he's being worshipped incorrectly,
what do you mean by
there are many times in the Bible where God steps in and destroys entire populations, because the flawed, the fact that he calls the flawed. There's one parable that I always find amusing, where he sends bears to maul a number of people. Okay. Whatever parables, don't worry.
I understand.
You get what I'm saying. Even if we assume free will, God's caring about free will seems inconsistent. But again, let's say that I assume free will to exist. It would be my moral duty to save somebody from being attacked or from being sexually assaulted. So if it's my moral duty, how could it not be God's? If I'm made in his image, and if God is supposed to be all loving and all knowing and all powerful.
Well, I mean, on the one hand, one thing you are discounting is God's free will. God has the freedom to do whatever he wants.
Sure.
And so like that is an integral part of the equation of that. Do people, being a compatibilist, do people have free will? Yes. And so in the instance of like the Elisha and the mama bears coming out and mauling the kids, the thing is, they had a choice that they made. He had a choice that he made, and we see the outcome of that event. Like if we change any circumstance, like let's say we change the dynamics or the equation of that circumstance from it's 40 boys or kids to 40 white supremacists, nobody has an issue now because we recognize the autonomy of those white supremacists to not be white supremacists, and they deserve to get mauled by bears.
No.
The thing is,
no, I can't hold on because I gotta address what you just said. If what you just said actually goes to my point, because if God chose to do nothing, then God is evil. That's what I'm saying. If the thing is, in God's, it makes a huge difference, especially. So let me put it this way: if I have a duty to stop violence from taking place, God has given it's even more so in the context of God, because God wouldn't, in his all-powerful nature, wouldn't need to spill an ounce of blood. He didn't need to maul anybody. He could have put a stop to it by a snap of a finger. That's what it would be to be all-powerful. And so none of that suffering. What do you mean?
Like, I mean, the boys were not making fun of the guy afterwards, were they? Like, the thing is, like, you can not like God's methods, but you can't pick and choose when and how you decide when God's allowed to use his methods.
No.
That in itself is arbitrary.
No, I'm not saying nobody's. This is not an issue of when he's allowed to. This is an issue of it's immoral to, in any context, given the nature of what this God is supposed to be. Not only immoral, but inconsistent with the way in which you've described the character of God. If you want to say that God is not all loving, but he's all powerful, then that makes sense. But if you want to say that he's all loving, then the method is inconsistent with the definition of what love is. You couldn't be all loving and let somebody get raped. You couldn't be all loving and let somebody get cancer and have a family devastated. That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying God is not allowed. God can do whatever.
Like there's a linchpin present there, and that you said that's inconsistent with what love is.
Sure.
Which first, on a deterministic worldview, you can't justify the existence of love to begin with.
Well, what do you mean?
But aside from that, purely material, like as far as like you would boil down love, affection, any of those things, those are just biological drives anyways. And that if you can love this person, you can love anybody else anyways. Like it's a problem that you kind of box yourself into, of that it's not a problem of love in its most general form, or it's not a problem for someone else's definition of love necessarily. It's a problem for your definition of love necessarily. It assumes that your definition of love is authoritative or objective, and that's not the case.
So a number of things. One, I don't think there's any problem with an understanding or a conceptualization of love from a deterministic point of view. I think often I see a false reductionism from people who want to criticize our ability to talk about love in deterministic terms. But again, I'm playing this game on your terms. Let's assume that free will exists. Let's assume that there is something beyond the physical. The problem remains. I don't think it's just my definition, unless you want to claim that love is just anything goes and has no definition we can point to, at which point we're just playing a word game there. I can't imagine. Forget naturalism. Because again, I acknowledge. Let's approach this in the worldview where free will exists. I don't see a context in which allowing rape can coincide with any definition of love, and those that again, I think my concern is that ultimately, if somebody's trying to define love in a different way, that to me seems almost sociopathic. Like if you think that love can allow for the trauma that can come from the things we've described, that somehow can be reconciled with love, I don't know what you mean by that. Like I don't know what your definition of love is. That could be possible.
Well,
you
that
may be
inserts the
right.
problem that you were mentioning earlier, of that reality does not cater itself to the way we wish things were. It is what it is. And so in this specific assertion of like, just because you can't imagine what a definition of love that fits that does not mean that that definition of love does not exist. And then second thing, it does not mean that that love isn't valid as well. Like,
but language doesn't exist in a vacuum. The definitions don't appear from thin air, right?
well, I'm
Like,
not talking about like an ethereal. This isn't a semantic issue.
I think it is. That's the problem.
Your definition of love is this, which is fine. You can hold that. You just cannot expect that definition of love to be authoritative on other people, first off, or on an omnipotent, all-powerful, like that, a being that is in every way beyond that definition. Like it's something you have to recognize, of that just because you disagree does not make you right and God wrong.
No, but I think what you're saying is a bit of an evasion. Like if you want to say, if you want to say that, how do I put this? Well, let me ask you straight up then. So your claim as a Christian is that a concept and a definition of love is consistent with allowing and watching your creation die, be raped, be killed, get disease. Like in your definition of love, those type of circumstances would fit that definition of what you're calling love to be. Is that what you're claiming?
It can be. And the reason I can say that is, think about it. Do you have kids by any chance?
No.
No, you don't? I got one on the way. And it's terrifying in every sense of the word. Is terrifying because you realize how much bigger the world is than what you would like. When I got like, when you get married, for instance, when you get engaged, like your world expands in a way that you don't really like. I spent 22 years consecutively. The only thing I cared about was me, because it's the only thing I was responsible for. And then I got married, and now every decision I make has these overwhelming implications on the thing, what's going to happen to my wife as well. And now like that we're thinking of like the baby that simply when you enter every individual's personal autonomy, free will into the equation of that. I mean, having been a youth pastor and having sat across from parents that they did everything the right way as far as raising kids, the way like they loving homes, stayed together, got their kids to every event that they were supposed to be to, helped them with their home. Like they did everything right. And yet their kid is still doing X behavior that both like that they and their society kind of that frowns upon that. And the question is but what do we do? And simply, if you have an autonomous being that does not see the error of their behavior, that sometimes a person has to learn on their own. And it's a difficult and it's a hard conversation to have. It's a hard reality to reckon with, because of the fact that sometimes a person wants to be free, wants to be autonomous, wants to be independent more than they want to be safe, more than they want to be whole, more than they want to be any of those things. And the only
I
thing
think
that
most
you can
people
do,
don't. I think that's seems to me like the only autonomy that's being respected here is the autonomy of the rapist as opposed to the victim. And again, in terms of free will and God's respect for free will, that is seen as quite inconsistent in the Bible. But I just want to say, because I do think there's a bit of a roadblock when it comes to this conversation, is that I think you've expressed exactly, you sort of embodied my fundamental problem with religion, which is that I think it can make otherwise moral human beings and intelligent human beings believe things that are sort of how would I say this, inconsistent with everything else that we know about what we are as human beings. We start, for me, it's just, it's like you're playing a language game suddenly where love could mean anything, and it's about whoever's particular interpretation of love, as opposed to being a concept which is a very specific criteria, very specific sort of concept, and has been so historically. That now it's like
that's true.
Well, maybe we have a difference in, maybe we just disagreeing with the language. Maybe
No, like
it might be
as
the
far as,
case.
like, you're saying that there's been this solid, continuous definition of what love means throughout human history or documented human history, and that I'm pretty sure that you can categorically disprove, simply because, I mean, the definition of, like, it used to be that you could marry anybody that you want.
Sure, some things may have
Right?
changed, right?
Right?
Well,
And
let me
so
rephrase that. Let me rephrase that because I think let me rephrase that because I think I misspoke there. It may be the case that different cultures, in terms of marriage and relationships and things like that, there have been different customs and things like that. But in terms of what we would look at as being a loving, because I assume you're not a cultural relativist, right?
what do you mean by that?
So you don't think that what's moral is simply what's dependent on the particular culture of the time?
I can be. It depends on specific, like, there are certain issues where that's applicable and there's certain issues where that's not applicable.
See, my approach is simply that if somebody at some point in time believed that the love, can be equatable to abuse or to let abuse take place, I don't think that that's a definition of love which makes sense. If you want to say that, okay, that is my just subjective definition, I think that's a strange thing to say. I think most people would probably agree with my. But again, that's fine. If that's the approach, if you want to say that your definition of love is one that's compatible with allowing rape to take place, then I appreciate your honesty. I think it's, I think it's, in terms of morally speaking, I think it's problematic. I think these are the evasions that otherwise they can only be. It's hard to even find the words. It's why I think that religion makes otherwise moral people believe and act immorally. It's exactly this kind of word games that I'm experiencing right now. And I would be curious to have you back when you do have your child to see if you remain of this opinion that you could define love in this other way you've defined it as. Because to me, it doesn't register. And again, I don't think you're a bad person. I'm not like trying to attack you personally, and I hope you don't feel that way. But I'm being honest with you that this type of approach to these questions is one of my primary reasons to oppose religion the way that I do, because I find it really morally problematic.
I think where I kind of see this is that the determinism conversation seeps in a lot here, of that because you believe that it's determined, which in this instance of like you have the same person, like same instance, like same event happens to two different people, that it was determined, that it's hard to get out of the bear trap of that if it was determined, then it was also inevitable. And that by doing so, but what you're attributing is that God causes this to happen, that God is guilty. And that
God is guilty by letting it happen. I'm not saying he's causing it, because let's assume free will exists. Again, in my approach to this, I was assuming your worldview to be true. I think the problem remains, even if you're right in your worldview, that actually doesn't resolve the problem for me. Forget determinism. I think that even if he's not causing it, he's letting it happen. And because he's all powerful, that's not okay with me.
But I mean, it's something that I guess the major issue there is that, I mean, I guess like, so you're assuming, here, let me phrase it this way. You're assuming that there is always a moral ought to intervene.
I think not necessarily always, because like I said before, I think some suffering is necessary. But I think there is an ought in certain contexts. And I think the context of rape in the context of childhood cancer is one of those, at least for the examples where it destroys people and destroys families, for the individuals that were completely destroyed by these things. And again, this might be an issue of what is accessible to us in the sense of empathy. Like, I may not be able to communicate to you why this is such a problem. It just is what it is. It might be just something that, we can't connect on in that way.
Well, I think like you keep rolling back onto this utilitarianism, that because it causes this specific outcome, that it should not have happened.
I'm a utilitarian. Yes, right? I acknowledge that. I'm mostly a utilitarian in a lot of ways.
So I'm not a utilitarian in that way, because on the one hand, we are not prophets, right? We don't know what the future is. I also, assuming personal autonomy, of that every second, every moment that goes by, a person has a freedom of will to choose in a compatibilistic, in a limited way, not necessarily, but they have a limited capacity to choose. And so if you're assuming that it's going to destroy their life, you're assuming an unknowable outcome.
No, hold on, because I'm not. That's not it though. That's not true, because I'm acknowledging that not necessarily. I can't predict which individual is going to suffer in that way or not. But I'm saying for those who will, and there are some that have, that's what I'm referring to. I'm not saying that everyone is necessarily going to be destroyed, but those who are is what I'm talking about. And again, forget, let's assume free will exists.
Where you're sliding into is basically the prosperity style gospel of that if person believes in God, they shouldn't have to suffer. Or on the other hand, that if God is truly all good and all these things, that he should never allow suffering. And first, that's not the God of the Bible. Like the God that you're arguing against is not the God that Christian theists believe in. That
suffering of a specific kind. Suffering, not allow suffering of a specific kind. And not all, I think all suffering, like some suffering is necessary.
You keep saying like not of a specific kind, but that specific kind, that language you're using is all of suffering through a utilitarian lens.
No, that's not true. Because I can look at the specific consequences of specific suffering, like this, for example, the suffering that I might experience through a breakup. Okay, it's not going to be the suffering that I experience through a rape. Like they're not. It's not going to be the same type of consequences, psychologically speaking, and it's not going to be the same suffering. It's going to be a very different.
I mean, that's your opinion of like the obviously that's kind of like off the top of your head, but that's
it is
clearly
based
your
on
opinion of
psychology.
the matter, right?
No, not at all.
But
This is based on
for one person. I mean, like that's the reason why I brought up the idea that it is subjective. Of that, for one person, it might not be, and for another person, it might be severe. Like, I mean,
Yeah, but
just
for
because
those
your opinion of this severity of this suffering versus the severity of that other suffering isn't an objective
yeah, but I'm referring to the individuals who do experience it as I've described. Even if I want to acknowledge that some might not, and for those, it doesn't mean that suffering now is a blanket term without difference in degrees, because we can look at specific circumstances. I'm only referring to those individuals who did experience suffering to the degree in which I'm criticizing. And go ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I think this is a good example as to why I think ultimately it's not the deterministic approach which does away with empathy, but the more religious and dualistic approach, which I think can result in a lack of empathy in this context. You said that the God I'm arguing against is not the God of the Bible. I'm not sure what you meant by that, and we do have to probably finish up soon.
Right, I know we've gone way over that 2 years.
Yeah.
2 hours.
Oh yeah. No, I mean it's all good. I wasn't minding it.
The Bible is very upfront. Oh, sorry. You got
Go
something?
ahead.
Oh no, I was just saying it's not a big deal for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the God of the Bible is very upfront with the idea of suffering, and it actually says that suffering is in many ways the payment or the consequence of righteous living. That the more righteous, the more in concert with what God values that you try to live as, the more likely you will be to suffer. And that there's various reasons for that suffering. There's the growth and strengthening and refining aspects of suffering. There's the consequential suffering of the fact that human beings are broken, fallen, and selfish, and tend to harm one another in orders to fulfill their selfish desires. And there is the concerted suffering of that. God allows certain people to suffer in a particular way so that when other people suffer in that same way, that person can then be a more apt or better equipped individual to assist them. In the same way, like, for instance, we've been using the allegory or the analogy of rape for a while, of that simply the best equipped person to assist someone who has experienced rape is someone who has experienced rape. And that's unfortunate, but it is factual. And
yeah, but it wouldn't have to. But it wouldn't be factual, or wouldn't need to be factual, if God is what has been described by theists to be. That's the point. I acknowledge that. I agree with you. I do think that suffering is necessary for growth, but it depends on the context and it depends on the outcome. Where it serves people in that growth, fine. I might still have certain issues depending on the example. Where it doesn't serve them in that way, that's especially where the problem lies. And your example about a person that's been raped is going to benefit from interacting with another person who's been raped because they can help each other. Whether or not that's true and actually works out that way in actuality could be true and might not be true depending on the individuals. But I'm saying that none of that should ever happen in the first place, given the nature of what God has been described as. Yes, you can believe that suffering can be a tool for growth and implement a level of suffering which is going to be different that experienced to the trauma of rape. Like, there's a difference there. I can get behind suffering, generally speaking, but I'm saying there are certain types of suffering that I think is different than what you might want to support. That's what I'm saying.
But so there's a couple of things present in that. The first is that I don't make that value judgment about what kind of suffering is and is not valuable.
Right, I do. That's the difference. Sure.
Right, and the reason that you have that utilitarian hang up about outcome, but the thing is, even rape, even let's say, I mean, the worst thing imaginable that you can imagine, I mean, pedophilia, like whatever, the worst thing that can be possibly imagined, even those things with a sovereign, all-powerful, and all-loving God are redeemable because of the fact that even and I know that you don't like that answer, but
no, I appreciate that answer because it points to specifically where I think the problem lies. I mean, I think it's a good answer to show the ocean of difference, morally speaking, and in the way in which we conceive of these things, between those that implement a notion of God in the natural order of things and those who do not. So yes, of course, I'm not satisfied. I don't think that resolves the problem at all. But yes, I acknowledge I'm making a value judgment there, and I'm making a utilitarian argument there. And I think I'm rightly so, based on what I think I understand about phenomenology and what we are as conscious beings. I think there's just a wall there that in terms of just what we connect to in terms of empathy is and in terms of utility is just gonna we're not gonna find common ground there, because I think we're operating on different assumptions about what is possible.
One thing, in seminary, they teach something like they use the analogy of watch for falling stones. That because Christians believe that suffering is redeemable in all circumstances, whether that's something natural like a storm, or if that's an earthquake, or if that's a wildfire, or if that's something like genetic, like let's say a person's born with Down syndrome or with a open chest cavity or something like that, or if that's something where interactions have caused this thing, like predatory capitalist structures or rape or things like that. Like in all contexts of suffering, God is sovereign and seeking to redeem. And the main mechanism that God uses to redeem for his own purposes is other human beings. And that is what that clergy, and that's what Christians have sought to do, of that they experience suffering and they use that as a catalyst to help others manage and experience their own suffering in a productive way, whether that's through the purpose of founding things like, let's say, Celebrate Recovery, helping people get out of addiction, or becoming chaplains to be in the military or in the prison system to help spiritually guide people that are incarcerated and such, or to help people deal with things like post-traumatic stress, battle fatigue, and like all those things, like that Christians have seen that as an opportunity, that the reason God has allowed me to experience X is so that I can be equipped to help people with X exclusively.
So I mean, I understand the belief system there. I will say that from my perspective, it is a repugnant belief, but I do appreciate your honesty about it. I don't think, again, I don't think that anybody should have to help anybody else, because those things shouldn't happen in the first place. But I acknowledge that's a value statement or a value judgment. And yeah, I mean, look, I think this was important in depicting the severe difference in the way that some of these moral issues are understood by atheists and theists alike. Let's get to the question section, so we don't go too ridiculously long. But we'll have you back to talk about dualism, because I think that's an important conversation.
That could be a really great conversation. I agree.
Yeah. Mike, you want to throw in some questions?
Sure. I just maybe it would be better to explain what I was explaining to this guy in there, is that we nobody is separating value judgments from judgments of fact. So and I think that's the problem that I see with at least the Izot. And I'd love to have someone come on and explain it to me if they think I'm mistaken. But what I think people say, he said that's not the question. Value judgments are claims of preferred states of reality. Yes. So I think that's a misuse of language in the fact that we only operate on what is. It's all a collection of the evidence that we have, and we are always making value judgments with
I think
a judgment of fact with what the world is, or what we think the state of the world is.
But also, regardless, I think the is-ought distinction, I think, as an illusion for a number of different ways, and we don't have too much time to get into that now. But
Sure.
you mentioned somebody wanting to come on to actually have this conversation.
Yeah, and he might have been the person I messaged during the stream, but he lives in New Zealand. He's debated Tom Jump and a couple other guys. So I'll have to. I can't. It's Arjuna, I think. You say his name. I can't remember.
I don't know, but we'll definitely have this conversation and go into detail when we have more time. I think the field of phenomenology completely undermines this distinction. But I can't get into detail about that right now. So
Sure.
We'll leave it for next time. But I appreciate everybody coming in and express their ideas.
We have two. I think we have two questions.
Okay.
One is I have it marked at 7:20, and of course it actually went away. So, but luckily I wrote it down, and it was from Kat. So, how does creative thinking fit in their view? And I think this is in reference of determinism. I think because that was posted way back early in the show.
Sure. Yeah, I would say that from my perspective, it fits in the way that all other causal relations and chain of cause and effect fit in. Whatever allows somebody to be creative, that capacity to do that is based on a neurology that the person themselves are not the author of. It's a blessing that some of us are able to do art and music and think creatively, but we don't. We're not choosing that. It's simply an ability that we possess because that's how we are.
Okay, and for you,
yeah, I think he and I have a different definition of what creativity means, which is kind of based on the differences in kind of what we believe, like determinism versus the compatible of that. I would say that creativity is the injection of new or what do you want to say, untethered influence into a new system. So if you look at the way, like, let's say Jim Lee versus I don't know who, Mark Bagley would draw a different character set, or the way like an anime artist versus a traditional comic book artist would draw a specific character, like that. You can see like that there are some comic books that are so good and narratively, but I just can't sit there and read them because they're drawn so poorly. And then the opposite of that, there's some that are drawn so well, but their narrative is awful. But that you see that a person injects not just a part of their past experiences, which is definitely true. Like they have past experiences and things that influence their art, but that they're injecting something of themselves, that mind-body dualism again, that they're injecting a part of their own being into what they've created. And that ends up being what creative thought, creative engineering, and so forth is in itself. That's what I would say.
Yeah, that's interesting for me because you're saying you put something of themselves. Are you trying to say that that's like somewhat like an immaterial part of themselves?
Maybe. I mean, like, even if you like, there's a whole thing in classic art of finding forgeries and stuff, of that when you look at something, let's say like a legitimate Jackson Pollock versus a forgery somewhere, you can look at it and man, it's close, especially something that's as abstract as a Jackson Pollock is. Like, it looks so similar, but there's just something essential about it that you can see that that's not the real thing. And the more strictly adherent to like art style that something happens to be, like a Monet or something, or an impressionist, that the more adherent it is, the more you know, like that what is and is not authentic, that you can tell that there's just something about it, and you can't necessarily put it into words. That they've even put like, depending on how high the canvas sat on the easel, how high or the height, the length of a person's arm affects the way they hold the brush and stuff. Like there's certain things about a person that influence the way they do art that's not reproducible. That even if you have like a print of it, obviously, like that a machine can reproduce something that's been done before, but they can't really create something new that hasn't been done at all.
Sure. I mean, I guess I would argue that from a reductionist standpoint of the physical components that are involved with that. But yeah, let's move on to the other question. Sorry, I got to scroll up from all these comments that we had. Oh, no, I'm sorry. It's right at the end here. For Jeff, could God do something to convince you that he is evil?
Good question.
It's a great question.
Yeah. I don't know what that would be. This kind of fits into that same line of questioning of the what could convince you that Christianity isn't true, or what would cause you to deconvert, what would cause you to doubt your beliefs. Like it kind of fits into that same realm, and I don't know what that would be. Like I've been an atheist at certain points in my life. I've been theist. I've been different things, secular humanist, and I've kind of been all over the map for like free will, determinism, stuff like that. And quite frankly, people say like, it seems like they try to like, well, let me compile this argument to prove to you that God is evil or that God isn't real or things like that. Of that, I don't know. Like, I don't know what exactly that would be, but I suppose like I'm willing to leave the card on the table. Like I doubt God all of the time. It's not something of like I've just gone all in at some point and now I'm not going to withdraw my savings from it. But I doubt God all the time. I doubt my presuppositions about theology. I doubt all those things on a regular basis.
Okay. Yeah, that's a fair answer. All right. And I think that might be all the questions, and we just hit about the 3-hour mark.
Yeah, that was crazy.
Yeah,
all right.
Long show.
Cool. Let me kind of maybe Jeff kind of flip that though, as far as Cease. Is there anything that you can think of that would convince you that God either exists, that God is real, that God is good, all loving? Any of those things that you've questioned before, like do you have an answer to that question?
Sure. I mean, it's a general answer, but I have somewhat of an answer. What will convince me would have to be to the same methodology that I use to believe in anything else. So a scientific approach with sound epistemology could easily convince me that belief in God would be reasonable if somehow we could access his existence through the same means that we can access other things. So if you're right about it being a different category and that being in principle impossible, then I don't see how that could happen. But if you're wrong about that and there is some approach to where God could be understood or discovered scientifically, then that would be different. In terms of the character of God, no, I don't believe that you can look at existence and reconcile the idea of God being both loving, as I understand love to mean, and all-powerful, as I understand all-powerful to mean. And if you want to say that my definitions are incorrect, I mean, it's a different conversation. I don't think they are, and I think I have good reasons to hold on to those definitions. But that's all I can really say about that.
So it's funny, guys, because earlier in the day I'd watched a Star Trek episode, and I thought this was very funny and somewhat valid point in a sense. But So there's this, and I'll make this short, and we'll end on this. There was this, I think they're called the Eidos, these group of people that the Enterprise comes up upon, and they basically they worship this thing that they call God in the sky, and it has protected them and helped them out. And the Enterprise figures out that some kind of intelligent life form that's kind of halfway in one dimension and halfway not in the other, and it's just trying to basically help these people out. And Picard sits down with Data, who's an AI or like robot, and basically goes, and Data goes, what could you possibly convince somebody of, if it was a god or just a very high intelligence life form? How would you know? I mean, how would there be any way to know? And I think these kind of questions, you can play these games a lot, right? It could be just something we have no idea how to explain. The same way if I went back in time and showed someone my phone, they'd probably think I was a prophet, right? And they'd probably have good reasons based on what their reasons were at the time. That's definitely, something spooky going on. And I think that these things, what they do is what they point out is that the ball isn't really in anybody's court, but the person that has the ability to convince that person. If they exist and they're the ones who are hiding and they're outside of all these things, it is not logical or rational for that person who is confined into the space, of a hole, in the house that's so tiny, to be able to find, the big guy that knows where the hole is, what's in the hole, how the thing in that little hole thinks. It literally has the ball in its court, and it's up to it, to serve it to us. And so,
especially if the goal is to be with his creation.
Yeah.
And then, it's even more so in that context, where why would it be inaccessible to somebody like myself if the goal is to, for me to be with God? I don't choose what I find convincing. I would be happy if actual evidence was provided, but I've never seen anything remotely convincing.
Yeah.
And, but.
Yeah.
Well, I think on that it kind of goes back to what I was talking about of tools, of that there's a lot of things that we think are mundane now. Like, for instance, Web 2.0 kind of stuff, YouTube, all these things that if you were to try to explain that to someone 100 years ago, or Bugatti just broke the 300-mile-an-hour barrier in a motor car, which is contestable, but they did it. And that was something that was like, it's not possible because of limitations of materials they had available. And now they just did it. And so there's something of that, it has to be, like you were saying earlier, that it has to confine to my definitions of what I think reason, or what my definitions of what this, that, or some other things are, in order for me to be convinced. And I find that to be a little bit self-delusive, delusional, that it convinces yourself of that what you believe about this, that, and the other XYZ is reasonable to believe it. And so everything needs to confine itself into this category for me to find it or to respect it. And I think that that's a little bit.
Well, no. So I think that's a fair perspective to come from if you miss one very important aspect, and that is the fact that nothing is stopping you from coming up with just infinite amount of ideas of how the origins of the universe are, what type of God. Once somebody disproves maybe the God idea you have, that to change the falsification criterion, like nothing stops this, because all these are ideas in our head, right? They don't actually do things. They don't, they don't have like physical representations of like being able to, like, I can't use my idea to do what I want it to do. I can use my idea to figure out if it's true about reality. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to map it. And so the problem that I have with that perspective of saying that it has to fit to my criteria or this is that it would suffer a problem of underdetermination if I was to lower those standards in such a way where now, if I've lowered them, I can believe anything, really legitimately anything at all. And I'm under the same basis. And to me, you have to tighten up on those kind of standards of evidence.
There's a reason why the methodology and the epistemology is what it is. And it's not just a matter of random, opinion or random definitions that are arbitrary. It's the method is what it is because it works. And because I think it's easy to show why it's the most reasonable approach as opposed to any other. And why claiming that those tools, while possibly limited, can't be replaced the way that you were claiming earlier by other tools. Part of that, because what Mike just said, what would result in the determination of theories,
which usually is used for a problem for scientific realism, but I think they actually missed the point of what it's
exactly.
Yeah.
But there are other reasons.
I kind of find that to be a little bit of a not really strong, but like a slippery slope fallacy of that. Well, could you believe anything? Because I can just simply say no, it wouldn't. But
yeah, what criterion are you using to determine that, right? You're setting yourself up guidelines and basically like a guidebook on why you wouldn't believe. You would be able to explain to me why you didn't believe in that thing, right? And so you are always creating some form of a standard. And so to then use it against us and say like, well, if it doesn't fit to it's gonna have to. I mean, you have to have these kind of value judgments in that. And the thing is, or I think earlier Cease kind of said, if someone said they went to the it was like a political thing and they were there, that's one thing. But if they were floating around the room and doing all this if you just lower that to like, because that person who says that Trump was floating around the room, they could use your argument and say, well, if you really didn't, if it had to fit your criterion, then of course. But the problem is that it works better on the other side to say that if I don't do this, if I don't, employ these kind of standards, then yes, I this is how con men con people. This is how people get into homeopathic remedies. This is how people get tricked. I mean, that's the only way people get tricked is by being gullible.
Well, I don't think that's kind of where I'm saying about a slippery slope fallacy is that's not necessarily equated to being gullible. It just means that I'm more like, imagine if in science there's Newtonian physics and then there's Einsteinian physics, and that if you try to align things that only work with Einsteinian model physics to fit with Newtonian, it'll never function. It'll never work that way because these are two entirely separate universes.
This is false. The Newtonian physics is contained within Einsteinian physics.
Right.
So it's not that it's a different thing. It's all a matter of using different tools. Is that one was limited in certain regards, and the other showed where the original failed. But again, this is still using the same methodology. We haven't shifted methodologies here. It's still the scientific method. It's just the scientific method is what showed us why one approach ultimately failed, as opposed to the new one. But it's not a shift in tools here.
I mean, do you value learning, like in your daily life? Do you value learning from your mistakes?
For me?
Yeah. Do you value learning from your mistakes? Yeah. So, and that's my kind of problem with on the other side is that it seems that science doesn't seem to get that kind of pass in some respects. And I'm not trying to straw man you or anything, but it does seem sometimes that this aspect of being able to correct a model or being able to, like what Cease is saying, I mean, that is just the methodology, in action in either regard of what you're saying. So I wouldn't see why, that process of developing a standard, based on these kind of mistakes. Because if someone tells me that they, swam in a pool and then I found out they're lying to me, it's like, okay, well, I'm going to raise it and go, I'm not going to trust Fred when he tells me these things because, he lies to me. Right. And so you're always correcting yourself in that sense. That's how we get to what is rational and what is not rational from my perspective.
Yeah, but in the analogy I'm using there is that you think determinism versus free will is the difference between using the mathematical models of Newtonian versus Einsteinian physics. You can try to force those things to fit into one of those worlds, but if you're going to hold the line, I guess, on no, you need to explain everything in physics, quantum physics, macro physics, you need to convince me. The only way you're going to convince me is that you have to boil it down to fit into Newtonian physics models, then it's never going to function that way. Like, you'll never be able to be convinced because you've set an artificial standard that's incredibly rigid, sure, but also
Well, no, because it's the
incapable.
method that you're no.
But this is fails. Yeah, sorry, Mike. You were
No. I was just simply, you go ahead. But it's just it's the method. Like, you would still be applying the same method. It's not like you would never get off the ground to that model, right? If you had never used that method to get there. That's why
right.
I'm having a problem with this.
You're assuming it's not like with Newtonian physics and Einsteinian physics we're using two different methods or we're using two different tools. We have two different theories that we've arrived at through the same methodology. So you're not abandoning the methodology that got us there to both perspectives in the first place. It's just that using the original method, the one method, then we can build upon that, see where, with new evidence, where we've been wrong in the past, and build towards a better model in the future. The analogy doesn't work because it's assuming
you're actually
that
you're agreeing with me, not disagreeing with me, in that yes, that's true. That you build out these models, and then you're supposed to do that when this model has failed, that you move on to the next one, and that because it's supposed to, through question and answer skepticism and experimentation, you test your model until it doesn't work anymore.
Yeah, but you're confusing model and method. Yeah, but you're confusing what the model is in science with what the method is in science. The problem isn't the method. Because originally we claimed the method is what is the limitation. It's a different thing there. But we do got to wrap this up because it's past 10.
Sure.
Right.
But I appreciate you coming on, and we'll have you back at some point.
Yeah, Jeff, did you want to get just one last word before we close out?
Well, I think that's the thing of it, because we're both using question and answer, experimental processes to get to our conclusions, which is interesting because as far as the model forms that we've been using, like determinism and free will and all that, we're really far apart on most of those things, but we've been using mostly the same approach to kind of find our landing space on those issues.
I would disagree with that. I actually don't think that's true.
We're interpreting data in different ways. We're interpreting, we're drawing different conclusions from the same, for instance, with the idea of suffering, of that we see the same data as far as how much suffering there is and different people's responses to suffering. We see the same data, but but our methodology, those things to mean different things.
Yeah, but we're interpreting differently because our methodology, I think, ultimately is different. But I get what you're saying, and like I said, I appreciate you coming on, and
that might be a good place to come back on and have a discussion.
Yeah, for sure, and thank you for dedicating this time to this. I think it was beneficial, and I appreciate that. So
yeah, as well. And for just to wrap it up real quick, anyone that's still listening, we do have I got one guest that's going to come on. I'm going to talk to him about. I think we're going to talk about the Bible. We're going to figure it out. We're going to talk about something. You'll be interested, hopefully. But with that said, guys, hopefully we will see you next time. And please subscribe, share with your friends, like the video, do all that fun YouTube stuff. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Peace.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.